They threw him to the dirt like he was nothing. 3 men boots planted wide spitting words he couldn't answer fast enough. "Speak English or get out!" Blood ran from his lip. He didn't fight back. He didn't run. He just knelt there in the dust, gripping a leather satchel like it held his last breath. Then a woman's voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough." Clara Bennett stepped between him and the men who wanted him gone, and nothing in Harland Creek was ever the same again. If this story moves you, subscribe and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The dust hadn't settled from his fall before the first boot came again, catching him under the ribs, and Elias, though nobody in Harland Creek knew that name. Yet nobody had asked. Nobody cared to ask, folded around the blow without a sound. He'd learned long ago that sound only made men hit harder. Silence sometimes was the only mercy a man could offer himself. "Get up," Walt Dobbins said, though it wasn't a request. Walt was Caleb Dawson's foreman, built like a barn door, and twice as slow to think, but quick enough with his fists when Caleb wasn't around to see it done proper. "Get up and get gone. We don't want your kind here." Elias raised his head. Blood traced a thin line from his split lip down to his jaw, and he wiped it with the back of his hand, slow, deliberate, the way a man wipes something off that doesn't belong to him. His eyes pale gray, strange to this town. Strange the way the whole of him was. Strange, moved from Walt to the 2 men flanking him, then past them to the dozen or so townsfolk who'd gathered on the boardwalk to watch. Not one of them moved to help. Not one of them moved to stop it, either. They just watched the way people watch a dog get kicked when it isn't their dog. "Van," Elias said. It was the only word he offered. His voice came out low, rough, carrying an accent that curled the edges of his vowels into something none of them had heard before. Not Mexican, not Indian, not anything they had a name for, which made it worse somehow. Made him worse. A stranger they couldn't place was more frightening than a stranger they could. "What in the hell is that supposed to mean?" Walt said, and he laughed, and the 2 men beside him laughed too, though neither of them looked entirely comfortable doing it. Elias tried again, his hand rising, fingers curling toward the mountains at the north edge of town, toward the gray shoulders of rock that stood behind a haze of heat and drought dust. "Van," he said again, more urgent now. "Water, I show you." "He's talking about water," said a thin voice from the boardwalk, Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the mercantile and had opinions about everything and courage for none of them. "Lord, as if we don't know we're dying of thirst already. As if some drifter who can't even talk right is going to tell us something we don't already know. I ain't looking to hear a foreigner lecture me about my own land," Walt said, and he grabbed a fistful of Elias's coat. A heavy wool coat entirely wrong for the summer heat, which was itself a small mystery nobody had bothered to solve, and hauled him half up off the ground before letting him drop again. "This is Dawson land near enough. Caleb don't like strangers wandering through, especially ones that come out of the mountains with nothing but a bag and a mouthful of gibberish. You could be anything, a thief, worse." "No," Elias said. "Just that. No elaboration, no defense because he didn't have the words for one, not in this language that fit his mouth like a boot 2 sizes wrong. He'd had the words once in another tongue, in another life, across an ocean that felt further away every year. But that life was gone. Burned down to embers, the way a homestead burns down to embers, and all he had left was this. A satchel, a coat too heavy for June, and a memory of water running cold and sweet through limestone, up where the drought hadn't reached yet. Walt drew back his fist. "That's enough." The voice came from the boardwalk outside the boarding house, sharp as a rifle crack, and every head turned. Clara Bennett stood in the doorway of the Bennett house, with a broom still in her hand, as if she'd walked straight out of her sweeping, without a thought for what she was walking into. She was 31 years old, unmarried, and she ran the only boarding house left standing in a town that was slowly dying of thirst. And she had never in her life been the kind of woman who raised her voice in public. She raised it now. "Walt Dobbins, you put your hands down before I tell your mother what you've been doing on a Tuesday afternoon." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the small crowd, and Walt's face went red-torn between the impulse to finish what he'd started and the older, deeper impulse bred into him since boyhood not to make a fool of himself in front of Clara Bennett, whom half the unmarried men in town were sweet on, whether they admitted it or not. "This ain't your business, Clara," Walt said, but the fist had already come down unclenched. "Everything that happens on my street is my business." She came down off the porch steps, broom still in hand, like it might do her some good, and crossed the dusty gap between the boarding house and the small crowd gathered around the stranger on the ground. She didn't look at Walt, she looked at Elias. "Are you hurt?" He looked up at her, and something in his face changed. Not relief, not quite, but a kind of stunned recognition, like a man who has been speaking into a canyon for years and has just for the first time heard an echo answer back in a voice that wasn't his own. He shook his head. A lie. Blood still ran from his lip. "He's a drifter," Walt said. "Come walking in from the north with no horse, no wagon, nothing but that bag. Won't say where he's from. Won't say what he wants. Keeps going on about water like he's found the fountain of youth up in them mountains. And that's a reason to beat a man half to death in the street. Ain't beat him half to death, just teaching him some manners. Get off my street." Clara's voice didn't rise this time. It didn't need to. There was something in the flatness of it, the sheer unwillingness to be argued with, that made even Walt Dobbins take half a step back. "All of you, go on." For a moment, nobody moved. The heat pressed down on Main Street the way it had pressed down for 2 months straight now, without mercy, without a single cloud breaking the white glare of the sky, and the whole town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether Clara Bennett's word would carry more weight than Walt Dobbins's fists. It did. Not because anyone respected her more than they feared Caleb Dawson. Nobody in Harland Creek feared anything more than they feared Caleb Dawson. Not God, not the drought, not the bank. But because there was something about a woman standing her ground in the middle of the street, unarmed, but for a broom that shamed grown men into backing down faster than a gun would have, Walt spat in the dirt close enough to Elias's boot that the message was clear enough without translation. "Your funeral, Clara. Caleb ain't gonna like this. Caleb doesn't own this street. Caleb owns near enough everything else." Walt turned, jerked his chin at the 2 men beside him, and the 3 of them walked off toward the saloon, already laughing about something, already forgetting the way men like that always forgot the things that didn't cost them anything. The rest of the small crowd dispersed slower, throwing glances back over their shoulders at Clara, at the stranger, at the strange tableau of a respectable boarding house woman, kneeling now in the dust of Main Street, beside a man nobody could place, and nobody trusted. Mrs. Pruitt lingered, longest arms crossed over her narrow chest. "You're going to regret this, Clara Bennett. Mark me." "I mark you every day, Agnes. Doesn't stop you from talking." Mrs. Pruitt's mouth pinched into a thin line, and she turned and went back into her mercantile, and then it was just the 2 of them, Clara and the stranger, in the wide, dusty, sun-scorched quiet of a street that had emptied out around them like water draining from a basin. "Can you stand?" Clara asked. Elias looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strange sensation of being read the way you'd read a letter, slow and careful, searching for the meaning underneath the words. Then he nodded and got to his feet without her help, though he swayed once before he found his balance. He was taller than she'd realized kneeling as he'd been, and beneath the ridiculous heavy coat, she could see the lean, hard set of a man who worked outdoors for a living, who was more accustomed to mountains than to men. "Thank you," he said. The words came out careful, spaced like stones, set one at a time across a stream. "You, kind." "I'm not kind," Clara said, brushing dust off her skirt more out of habit than necessity. "I just don't like watching 3 grown men gang up on somebody who can't fight back." "I fight," Elias said, and there was the faintest flicker of something in his gray eyes. Pride, maybe, or the ghost of an old temper. "If I want." "Then why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. His hand went to the satchel at his side, gripped it the way a man grips something he's sworn to protect. "Not here for fight," he said finally. "Here for—" He struggled, his jaw working, searching for the word and not finding it. He pointed instead toward the mountains, toward the pale haze of heat that hung over the whole valley like a shroud. "Water," he said again. "I know water, up there. Everybody in this valley knows there's water in those mountains." Clara said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of a woman who'd heard every variety of false hope over the last 2 dry months. Doesn't do us a lick of good if we can't get to it, or if it's frozen solid 9 months a year, or if it's 100 miles past where any wagon could go. No, Elias said, and shook his head hard. Urgent. Now his hands moving in front of him, as if he could carve the shape of his meaning into the hot afternoon air. Close. Close water. I find. I show. Clara studied him. There was a kind of desperation in his face that she recognized, not the desperation of a liar trying to talk his way into a meal, but the desperation of a man who has something true to say and no way to say it. A man drowning not in water, but in the absence of a shared tongue. She'd seen that look before a long time ago, on a different face, in a different circumstance. She didn't like to think about anymore. It had cost her something once, believing a man who couldn't explain himself. It might cost her again. What's your name? She asked. Elias. Just Elias. He hesitated, and something crossed his face, not quite shame, but something adjacent to it, an old wound touched by accident. Elias, he said again, firmer, as if the repetition would make it enough. Well, Elias. Clara looked back toward the boarding house, toward the porch, where her broom still leaned against the rail, where she'd left it, toward the whole quiet, respectable, gossip-hungry structure of a life she'd built for herself out of the wreckage her parents had left behind. She thought of what taking him in would cost her: the whispers, the ruined reputation, the fury of a man like Caleb Dawson, who did not take kindly to being crossed, and who had made his opinion of foreigners abundantly clear on more than one occasion. She thought of all of it, and then she thought of the blood on his lip, and the way he'd knelt in the dirt without making a sound, absorbing the blows, like a man who'd absorbed worse before, and expected to absorb worse again. I've got a room, she said. 2nd floor back of the house. It's small and it's hot this time of year, but it's got a bed and 4 walls, and nobody's going to drag you out of it by the collar. $1.50 a week if you've got it. If you don't, we'll work something out. Elias blinked at her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the porch, something like hope moved across his face. Raw, unguarded, almost painful to look at. The way a man's face looks when he's stopped expecting kindness, and then receives it anyway. Why? He asked. Why you help? Clara considered the question longer than she meant to. The honest answer that she didn't entirely know that something about the way he'd knelt in the dirt without flinching had cracked something open in her chest that she'd kept carefully shut for years, wasn't an answer she was ready to give a stranger or herself. Because somebody ought to, she said instead. Come on, before Caleb Dawson hears about this and decides he wants a say in it. The walk from the street to the boarding house was short no more than 30 yards, but Elias moved through it like a man crossing hostile territory. His eyes cutting left and right, cataloging the faces in the windows, the shapes behind curtains, the town's collective attention pressing against him from every direction. Clara noticed. She noticed the way his shoulders stayed tight even after they'd climbed the porch steps, and the door had shut behind them, sealing out the heat and the stairs alike. You're safe here, she said, setting the broom back in its corner, with more force than the task required. Whatever they told you out there, you're safe in this house. Elias didn't answer right away. He stood in the front hall of the Bennett house, looking around at the modest furnishings. A worn settee, a hall table with a chipped porcelain bowl, a staircase leading up into shadow, with the careful attention of a man memorizing an escape route, or perhaps simply a man who had learned the hard way not to trust a room until he understood every corner of it. Safe. He repeated, testing the word, and something in the way he said it suggested it wasn't a word he entirely believed. Not yet. Not from anyone. You hungry? Clara asked. I've got bread from this morning, and some beans on the stove if you don't mind them plain. We're rationing everything else on account of the drought. Drought, Elias said, and nodded slowly, as if the word confirmed something he'd already suspected. Long time. No rain. 2 months. Closer to 2.5 now. Clara led him toward the kitchen, and he followed, still gripping the satchel like it might be taken from him if he loosened his hold for even a moment. Creek's down to a trickle. Wells are going dry one by one. We lost the Hendersons' whole herd last week, just up and died in the field, poor thing's tongue swollen from the heat. Caleb Dawson's stock is faring better on account of he's got the only reliable well left in the valley, and everybody knows it, and everybody hates him for it, and nobody says a word because half the town owes him money one way or another. She hadn't meant to say so much. It wasn't her habit laying out the town's troubles to a stranger she'd known for all of 10 minutes. But something about the quality of his attention, steady, patient, entirely without judgment, loosened her tongue the way nothing had in longer than she cared to admit. Caleb, Elias said, and his brow furrowed, working through the shape of the name. The man who... He gestured vaguely toward the street, toward the men who'd beaten him. No, that was Walt. Walt works for Caleb. Does most of his dirty work from what I can tell. Clara set a pot on the stove, added water from the barrel by the door, carefully, sparingly, the way everyone in Harland Creek measured water these days, ounce by precious ounce. Caleb Dawson owns half the land in this valley, and would like to own the other half. He's not evil exactly. He just believes the valley belongs to men like him, and anybody who's not like him is a threat to be managed, or removed, whichever's easier. Elias watched her work, his gray eyes following the economical movements of her hands. You not like him, he said. It wasn't a question. Clara laughed short and without much humor. No, I'm not like him. I'm the daughter of a man who died owing him money running a boarding house. That's one bad month away from going under. And I've got exactly one thing in this world that's still mine outright. And that's this house and the ground it sits on. So no, Elias. I am not like Caleb Dawson, not even a little. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire catch beneath the pot. Then carefully, as if setting each word down like a stone, he wasn't sure would hold his weight. I help. Water. I find close water. Save valley. I show you show all if you help me talk. Clara turned from the stove and looked at him properly. For the first time really looked at him, not as a stranger to be pitied or managed, but as a man with a purpose so urgent, it had driven him down out of the mountains alone on foot, into a town that had greeted him with fists. There was something in his face that she recognized from her own reflection some mornings, the particular exhaustion of a person carrying something too heavy to be carried alone. You want me to help you talk to the town, she said slowly. Convince them to trust a stranger who beat his way into Harland Creek looking like he'd been sleeping rough for a month, speaking a language nobody here has ever heard about a water source you say is close by, but haven't shown a single soul yet. Yes. Elias said simply, as if the impossibility of the task hadn't occurred to him, or had occurred to him, and been dismissed as irrelevant, beside the greater impossibility of watching a whole valley die of thirst while he did nothing. That's not going to be easy. I know. He set the satchel down at last on the kitchen table, and from it he withdrew a small object wrapped in a strip of worn cloth. He unwrapped it with the same careful reverence he'd shown the bag itself, and set it on the table between them. A stone smooth and rounded. The pale gray-green of creek water running over limestone, worn utterly featureless by years, decades, maybe centuries of moving water. This, he said, from spring, close, not far. I find I mark I come here. He tapped the stone once gently with a single finger, the gesture of a man touching something sacred. I not lie. I not thief. I come to help. Clara picked up the stone. It was cool despite the heat of the kitchen, cool in a way that seemed impossible in a valley where every surface, every object, every living thing had baked for 2 months under a merciless sun. She turned it over in her palm, and something about its coolness, its impossible persistence of cold in a world gone dry and hot, made her chest tighten with something she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite hope, because hope had betrayed her too many times this summer already. But something adjacent to it, something that hurt in the same place. Hope hurt. Where did you find this? She asked, quieter now. North, Elias said. 2 days' walk, maybe 3 with wagon with rock to clear. His hand moved again toward the window, toward the mountain standing gray and indifferent beyond the heat shimmer. Spring, cold, fast water. I find by accident, I hunt, I follow deer. I find water where maps say no water. He looked at her, and his gray eyes had gone intense, almost fevered, the look of a man who has seen something miraculous and cannot bear the thought of nobody believing him. "I think town need water. I try to say. Nobody listen. Nobody understand." "I believe you," Clara said, and was startled to realize as the words left her mouth that she meant them. Elias went very still. "You believe," he repeated, as if testing the sentence for cracks for some hidden trapdoor of cruelty she might drop him through. "I believe you," she said again, firmer. "I don't know how we're going to prove it to anybody else in this town. Lord knows Caleb Dawson isn't going to take the word of a boarding house woman and a stranger who can barely string two English words together. But I believe you found something up there. And if there's even a chance you're telling the truth, then I'd be a fool not to help you try." Something moved across Elias's face. Then something raw and unguarded. The expression of a man who has spent so long being disbelieved, dismissed, beaten for the crime of being foreign and unintelligible, that a single sentence of belief lands on him like water on cracked earth, soaking in deeper than it has any right to. "Thank you," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, and he looked away from her toward the window, blinking hard, as if a man who'd absorbed a beating without a sound could nonetheless be undone entirely by simple kindness. Caleb Dawson heard about the stranger before the sun went down. He heard it from Walt Dobbins first over a whiskey at the Golden Spur Waltz account, colored by his own bruised pride at having been shamed in the street by a woman half his size. He heard it from Mrs. Pruitt second, who stopped by the ranch on the pretext of discussing a bill, and stayed 40 minutes discussing instead the scandal of Clara Bennett taking a foreign drifter into her home, unmarried, unchaperoned, God knows what kind of man he might be. And he heard it a third time from his own daughter Sarah, 16 years old and prone to gossip, who'd heard it from a friend who'd heard it from someone else entirely. The story growing new and more alarming details with every telling. Until by the time it reached Caleb's ears that evening, the stranger had become a wanted criminal. Possibly an outlaw. Possibly worse. Caleb Dawson was 45 years old, built solid through the chest and shoulders from 4 decades of hard ranching, with a face that had weathered into something permanently stern. Deep lines bracketing a mouth that rarely smiled, and eyes the color of old iron. He was not, as he'd have told you himself, an unreasonable man. He believed in order. He believed in the rule of law, insofar as the law served the interests of men who'd built something worth protecting. And he believed, with the unshakable conviction of a man who has never had cause to question it, that Harland Creek belonged to people who spoke its language, worked its soil the way its soil had always been worked, and did not bring foreign trouble down out of the mountains to unsettle a town already teetering on the edge of ruin. "A drifter," he said, standing on his own porch in the last orange light of evening, looking north toward the mountains, where the heat still shimmered even as the sun went down. "Comes walking in with no horse, no papers, can't speak 2 words of proper English, and Clara Bennett takes him into her house like a stray dog." "That's what I heard," Walt said, standing a respectful 2 steps below him, hat in hand. "Says he knows where there's water, some kind of secret spring up in the mountains." Caleb's mouth twisted not quite a smile. "Secret spring. That's what he's saying. Or what folks think he's saying, hard to tell the way he talks. And Clara believes him." "Seems to, yeah." Caleb was quiet for the long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkening line of the mountains on the valley spreading out below his porch. His valley in every sense that mattered to him, purchased with his father's sweat and his own defended, through droughts and hard winters, and the slow attrition of smaller ranchers who'd sold out and moved on rather than fight the land any longer. He thought of his own well, the one reliable source of water left in the whole basin, and the careful arithmetic he'd been running in his head for weeks now. How many more families would come to him? Hats in hand, asking to buy water, asking for loans, asking for mercy. He was willing to extend only on his own terms. A secret spring found by a stranger would upset that arithmetic considerably. "Walt," he said, "I want you to keep an eye on this fellow. Quiet like. Don't need to rough him up again. That's already cost me more goodwill in town than it was worth seeing, as half of Main Street watched you get put in your place by a woman with a broom." Walt's jaw tightened at that, but he said nothing. "I just want to know what he's really after. Water don't come free, not from a stranger, not from anybody. Man doesn't walk 2 days out of the mountains for the pleasure of being spat on in the street. He wants something. I mean to know what it is before Clara Bennett gets her whole boarding house and half this town believing in fairy tales." "Yes, sir." "And Walt." Caleb's iron eyes finally came down from the mountains and settled on his foreman cold and steady. "If he is telling the truth, if there really is water up there, I want to know that too, before anybody else does." Inside the Bennett house, night had settled thick and airless, the heat of the day trapped beneath the roof with nowhere to go. Clara sat at the kitchen table across from Elias, a single lamp burning low between them, casting long shadows against the walls. She'd found him a shirt that had belonged to her father, too broad in the shoulders, but close enough, and he'd washed the dust of the road off his face and hands, and in the lamplight cleaned up some of the wariness gone from his posture. He looked younger than she'd first taken him for. Not so much older than her own 31 years, maybe. "Tell me again," she said slower this time, "about the spring." Elias nodded and reached for a stub of charcoal she'd found for him, and a scrap of brown paper torn from a flour sack, and began to draw. Not words, because words still failed him too often, but shapes, the jagged silhouette of the mountains, a winding line that might have been a trail, a small cluster of marks that could have been rocks or trees or nothing at all that Clara could immediately identify. He worked with the focused intensity of a man translating something vital into the only language he had left. "Here," he said, tapping a spot on the paper. "Spring, cold water, come from rock. How you say?" He made a gesture, fingers spreading, mimicking something breaking open crack. "Water come from crack in rock. Always cold. Always run, even in dry time." "A limestone spring," Clara murmured half to herself. "My father used to talk about those. Said the old trappers found them sometimes up in the high country springs that never dried up because they came from so deep in the rock that no drought could touch them." She looked up at him. "Is that what this is?" "I not know the word," Elias admitted. "But yes, I think same thing you say. Water from deep, not from rain, not from creek, from—" He tapped the earth beneath the table, from under, always there. Clara leaned forward, studying the crude map, her mind already working through the logistics, even as some more cautious part of her tried to hold the hope at bay. "If it's real, if this is real, Elias, it could save this whole valley. Not just my boarding house. Everyone. The Hendersons, the Millers. Everybody who's lost stock this summer. Everybody who's one dry well away from having to pack up and leave everything their families built." "I know," Elias said quietly. "This why I come. This why I not leave even when they—" He gestured toward his split lip, toward the dark bruise already forming along his jaw. "Even when town not want me. Why didn't you leave? After what they did to you today, most men would have kept walking, found some other town, some easier welcome." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the crude map between them, on the small marks representing water he'd found and carried in his memory across 2 days of hard walking to deliver to people who'd answered him with fists. "I lose my home once," he said, finally, the words coming slow, effortful, dragged up from someplace deep and painful. "Long time ago. Across water, big water, ocean. Fire, drought, same like here. I watch—" His hand made a small, helpless gesture. "I watch everything I love die. I could not stop. I was too young, too weak, no power to help." Clara felt something twist in her chest, watching him force the sentences out one broken piece at a time, watching the old grief surface behind his careful gray eyes. "I come to this country," he continued. "I think new start, new land. But I still—" He pressed a fist briefly against his own chest. "Still carry that day. Every day. And when I find spring up in mountain, I think this time I not too weak. This time I not too late. This time I save something." The lamp flickered between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the confession hanging in the thick night air like something too fragile to disturb. I'm sorry, Clara said finally quietly, for what happened to you before. Elias looked up at her, and something in his gray eyes, some old deep wound finally acknowledged by another living soul, seemed to loosen just slightly, the way a wound loosens when it's finally been seen and named instead of hidden. You first person, he said, who ask, who listen, long time. Then I'm glad I asked. Clara reached across the table, not quite touching him, her hand resting near enough to his that the gesture couldn't be mistaken for anything but what it was, an offer tentative and sincere, of the kind of belief he'd apparently gone without for far too long. We'll find a way to show them Elias. The spring, the water will find a way to make them listen, even if it takes every ounce of stubbornness I've got. Even Caleb Dawson. Clara's jaw tightened at the name. Especially Caleb Dawson. Man's had this whole valley by the throat for years, doling out water like he's doing everybody a favor. If there's water up there that doesn't belong to him, that he can't control. She stopped herself, aware of how much anger had crept into her voice. He's not going to like it, not one bit. And he's not a man who takes things lying down when he doesn't like them. I'm not afraid of him, Elias said, and there was a quiet steel in the words that surprised her, coming from a man who'd knelt silent in the dirt only hours before, rather than fight back. Maybe you should be, Clara said. Just a little. Caleb Dawson doesn't fight fair, and he doesn't fight small. If he decides you and your spring are a threat to what he's built here, he'll come at you with everything he's got: his money, his men, the law, if he can bend it his way. I've seen him ruin people before, Elias. Good people. People who never did anything worse than get in his way. Elias considered this, his gaze drifting toward the dark window, toward the mountains hidden now in the deeper dark of full night. Then we go quiet, he said. We go careful. We find proof. Then we show town all together all at once before he can stop. A wagon? Clara said slowly, an idea forming. If we could get a few reliable men Caleb doesn't own outright, to go up there with you, see the spring for themselves, bring back proof. Word would spread faster than Caleb could smother it, especially if it came from men the town already trusts. Who? Clara thought for a moment, running through the faces of Harland Creek in her mind. Who among them might have the courage or the desperation to risk Caleb Dawson's wrath for the chance of saving their own dying land? Sam Hendricks, maybe. He lost half his herd already. He's got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. And old Judge Marsh, if he'll come out of his study long enough to see something with his own eyes, instead of reading about it in a law book. Judge Marsh, Caleb doesn't fully own. Nobody fully owns Judge Marsh, not even Caleb Dawson, and that counts for something in this town. Good, Elias said, and for the first time since he'd stumbled into Harland Creek that afternoon, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Small, tired, but real. We start tomorrow. We start tomorrow, Clara agreed. She showed him to his room not long after, small as she'd promised, tucked beneath the eaves at the back of the house, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked north toward the mountains he'd walked out of that morning. He stood in the doorway for a long moment after she'd lit the lamp for him, looking around the small space with an expression she couldn't quite read. This yours, he said. Room in your house. It's yours now for as long as you need it. I never have. He struggled for the word, gestured vaguely at the walls, the bed, the whole modest permanence of a room that belonged to someone, however briefly. Place. Since long time. Since home. I sleep outside mostly. Barn sometimes if farmer allow. Never room. Clara felt something ache behind her ribs, hearing the plain simplicity of that admission. A man who had walked so far, carried so much, and had nowhere in years to simply rest without fear of being moved along or worse. Well, you've got one now, she said, keeping her voice light, aware that too much sympathy might embarrass him, or worse, might feel to him like pity, which she suspected he'd had quite enough of for one day. Sleep well, Elias. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Clara. He said her name carefully, like he was setting it down beside the stone on the table. Another precious, fragile thing. Thank you. For today. For, he gestured encompassing the room, the house, the whole unlikely mercy of the day, for all. You already thanked me. Not enough, he said. Never enough for this. She left him then, closing the door softly behind her, and stood for a moment in the narrow hallway, listening to the small sounds of him, settling into a room that was his for the first time in longer than she could imagine. The creak of the bed, the soft exhale of a man finally allowing himself to stop bracing against the world, if only for a night. Downstairs, she banked the fire and blew out the lamps, and sat for a while in the dark kitchen, with the smooth gray stone still in her hand, turning it over and over in her fingers, thinking about water that never ran dry, about a man who'd lost everything once and come halfway around the world only to lose it again, about Caleb Dawson's iron eyes, and the particular ruthlessness of men who believed the land owed its loyalty to whoever held the most of it. Outside, the drought pressed on, silent and merciless, cracking the earth a little deeper with every rainless night. But upstairs, in a small room beneath the eaves, a stranger who'd walked out of the mountains with nothing but a stone and a secret slept for the first time in years without fear. And Clara Bennett sat alone in the dark, holding on to a small piece of impossible hope, and did not yet know how much it would cost her to keep holding on. She only knew that she would. The morning came gray and already hot heat pressing through the thin curtains before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and Clara woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood in her yard. She came downstairs in her robe, hair still loose over her shoulders, and found Elias already dressed, sleeves rolled to the elbow, working through a stack of cordwood that had sat untouched by the shed for 2 weeks because she hadn't had the time or the strength to get to it herself. He'd found her father's old axe somewhere, and he swung it with the easy, practiced rhythm of a man who'd done this kind of work his whole life, each log splitting clean in a single stroke. You didn't have to do that, she said, standing on the porch, arms crossed against the early chill that wouldn't last past sunrise. Elias looked up, wiped his forearm across his brow, and something in his face, still faintly bruised along the jaw, eased at the sight of her. You give me room, he said. Bed, food. I not. He searched for the word, found it, freeload. I work. That's not a word I taught you. I hear it. Man at saloon window yesterday. Say about me, freeloader. He said it without bitterness, simply reporting a fact the way he seemed to report most cruelties that came his way, noted, absorbed, set aside. So, I work. Show them wrong. Clara felt something twist behind her ribs, hearing him repeat the word so plainly, and she came down off the porch steps into the yard, the dirt still cool beneath her bare feet, before the sun climbed high enough to bake it. You don't have to prove anything to them. I do, Elias said, and set another log on the block, split it clean. Every day I prove. This how it work for men like me. You born here, they trust you first, prove wrong after. I born far, they doubt me first. I prove right, maybe they trust. Maybe. He shrugged, a small, tired motion. Maybe not, but I try. She didn't have an answer for that, not one that wouldn't sound hollow, so she went back inside and put coffee on, and by the time she came back out with 2 cups, he'd finished the woodpile entirely and moved on to the fence along the east side of the yard, tightening a post that had gone loose in last winter's frost. Sit, she said, holding out the cup. Even hard-working men take coffee. He took it, and for a moment they stood together in the thin early light, not talking, watching the sun climb over the ridge and turn the dry grass of the valley gold, then white, then the flat bleached color it had worn all summer. Today, Elias said finally. Sam Hendricks, Judge Marsh, you said? I said. Clara set her cup down on the porch rail. I'll go this morning before the heat gets too bad. Talk to Sam first. He's lost the most, he'll listen fastest. Judge Marsh is trickier. Man doesn't do anything quick, doesn't do anything without thinking it through 9 ways from Sunday. You want I come? Clara considered it, chewing the inside of her cheek. Every instinct told her that walking into Sam Hendricks' yard, with a foreign stranger at her side, the same stranger half the town had watched get beaten in the street yesterday, was asking for the conversation to go sideways before it even started. Not yet, she said. Let me talk to them first. Once they're willing to listen, then we bring you in, show them the map, let them hear it from you directly. But if you walk up with me cold, Sam's going to see the bruises on your face and the accent in your mouth and shut the door before either of us gets a word out." Elias nodded slowly, understanding, written plain across his face, even as something like hurt moved behind his eyes. Not hurt at her, she understood, but hurt at the world that made her caution necessary. "I stay," he said. "Fix fence. Fix roof, if you let. I not—" He tapped his chest. "Sit idle, waiting. You don't sit idle a day in your life, do you?" "Idle man," Elias said, "is man who think too much. I think enough already. Better I work." Sam Hendricks's ranch sat 2 miles east of town, a modest spread that had once run 400 head of cattle, and now, after the drought, ran barely 150, the rest either sold at a loss or dead in the field, bloated and stinking in the June heat, until Sam and his boys had burned the carcasses, rather than let the smell draw coyotes down from the hills. Clara found him repairing a water trough that no longer had any water to hold, hammering a new plank into the side out of pure stubborn habit, the kind of work a man does to keep his hands busy when his mind can't bear to sit still with what's actually happening to him. Clara Bennett. Sam straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers. He was a broad-weathered man in his 50s, gone gray early, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years staring into a merciless sun. "Heard you took in a stranger yesterday. Whole town's heard, matter of fact. Word travels fast in a town this small. Faster when it's got Caleb Dawson's foreman putting his boots to a man in the street for entertainment." Sam's mouth twisted, something dark and disapproving crossing his face. "Didn't care for that if you want to know. Man's got no horse, no gun, no way to defend himself, and Walt Dobbins and 2 others decide that's a fair fight. Ain't the kind of thing my father would have stood for, and I don't much care for standing for it either." Something loosened in Clara's chest, the first crack of an opening she'd hoped for and hadn't quite dared expect. "Then maybe you'll hear me out." She told him everything. The stone, the map, the crude drawings, the story of a limestone spring. 2 days' walk into the mountains. Cold water running from a crack in the rock, never touched by drought, because it came from someplace the sun and the sky couldn't reach. Sam listened without interrupting his weathered face, giving away nothing until she'd finished, and then he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his half-empty pastures, his dying grass, his cattle standing listless and thin in the shade of what few trees hadn't already dropped their leaves in premature autumn surrender. "You believe him?" Sam said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I do." "On what a stone and a hand-drawn map from a man who can barely put 2 English words together." "On the way he looked when he told me," Clara said, and heard how thin that sounded, even as she said it, and pressed on anyway. "Sam, I've had every kind of man walk through my boarding house door, drifters, liars, men, running from something or chasing something that didn't exist. I know what desperation looks like when it's lying to get a meal or a bed. This isn't that. This man walked 2 days out of the mountains, got beaten in the street for his trouble, and the first thing he did afterward was pick up an axe and start splitting my firewood, because he couldn't stand the thought of taking charity without earning it. That's not a liar's instinct. That's something else." Sam rubbed a hand over his gray-stubbled jaw, and Clara could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd done the night before, weighing the cost of foolishness against the cost of 150 cattle standing in a dead pasture, waiting to die, the way the other 250 already had. "I got nothing left to lose, near enough," he said finally. "Caleb's already circling, you know. Come by last week, all polite smiles, offering to buy my north section to help me through the dry spell. Man smells blood in the water same as anybody, and he knows exactly how close I am to signing whatever paper he puts in front of me." He spat in the dust, an old man's gesture of contempt. "I go up that mountain, and there's nothing there. I've lost a few days and some pride. I don't go, and there is something there, and I watched my whole herd die anyway, rather than take a chance. That's a harder thing to live with." "So you'll come?" "I'll come look. Can't promise more than that till I see it with my own eyes." Sam glanced toward the road toward the direction of town, and his expression sharpened with something more cautious. "You talked to Judge Marsh yet?" "Headed there next." "Good. Get the judge's word behind this before Caleb catches wind of what you're planning, because I promise you, Clara, the moment he hears there might be water up there that he doesn't control, doesn't sit on his land, doesn't come with strings attached to a man's mortgage or his pride, he is going to move heaven and earth to make sure nobody believes a word that stranger says." Judge Elias Marsh. No relation and irony, Clara noted with a small, tired smile when she remembered the stranger's name was 71 years old, half-retired from circuit riding, and spent most of his days now in a book-lined study at the edge of town, dispensing legal advice to whoever needed it and opinions to whoever didn't ask for them. He listened to her account with his spectacles pushed up on his forehead, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and when she'd finished, he sat quiet for a long moment in a way that made Clara's stomach tighten with the particular dread of waiting on an old man's judgment. "You understand," Judge Marsh said finally, "what you're asking me to risk. I understand what the whole valley risks if nobody looks. That's a lawyer's answer, Miss Bennett, and a fine one, but it isn't what I asked." He leaned forward, old eyes sharp, despite the years. "Caleb Dawson has spent 15 years building himself into the only water this valley can rely on. Every rancher who's had to come to him, hat in hand asking for a loan or a favor, or a well share, that's 15 years of debts owed of leverage banked, of a man quietly making himself indispensable so that nobody in Harland Creek could afford to cross him even if they wanted to. If there's a second source of water in this valley, one that doesn't run through Caleb's hands, that unravels every thread of power he's spent a decade and a half weaving. He will not take that lightly. He will not take it lightly at all." "I know that. Do you?" "Because your father knew Caleb Dawson too. Clara and your father died owing him $800, and I sat in this very room and watched Caleb decide out of some private calculation I never fully understood not to call in that debt against this house, which is the only reason you still have a roof over your head today, instead of a foreclosure notice." The judge's voice softened just slightly, an old man's weary kindness showing through the caution. "I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this so you walk into whatever comes next with your eyes fully open." Clara sat very still, feeling the weight of a debt she'd never fully understood settle newly heavy across her shoulders. "I didn't know that. There's a great deal you don't know about the arrangements that have kept this town standing as long as it has." Judge Marsh sighed an old man's sigh, tired in a way that went deeper than the summer heat. "But I'll come look at your stranger's map, and I'll ride out with Sam Hendricks if he's willing, because I am 71 years old, and I have watched this valley slowly strangle itself for 2 months now. And if there is a chance, even a slim one, that a stranger walked down out of those mountains carrying salvation in a leather satchel, then I would rather be a fool who looked than a coward who didn't." Chateau. She rode back into town with something loosening in her chest for the first time in days. Not certainty, not yet, but the fragile shape of allies. Where yesterday there had been none, and found the street outside her boarding house crowded in a way that stopped her breath cold before she'd even swung down from the wagon. A knot of people stood outside the Bennett house, a dozen or more, and at the center of them stood Caleb Dawson himself. Hat pushed back, iron eyes fixed on the porch where Elias stood with a hammer still in his hand, having apparently been interrupted mid-repair on a loose porch board. "Clara." Caleb's voice carried easy across the street, pleasant on its surface, the way a rattlesnake's rattle sounds almost musical if you don't know to be afraid of it. "Was hoping to have a word with your new tenant here. Seems he's not much for conversation, though, or maybe he just don't care to talk to me." "He talks fine," Clara said, coming up the walk fast, planting herself between Caleb and the porch steps, in a motion that felt more instinct than decision. "What do you want, Caleb?" "Just being neighborly." Caleb's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Man walks into my valley, my town starts telling folks he's found water. Figured I ought to hear it from him myself, seeing as water's a subject I know something about." "It's not your valley." Near enough. Caleb's gaze flicked past her up to Elias, taking his measure with the cold appraisal of a man pricing livestock. He got a name, Elias. Elias what? Clara opened her mouth to answer and found she didn't have one, realized with a small lurch that she'd never asked that the stranger's last name was as much a mystery to her as it was to Caleb Dawson, standing in her street demanding it. Just Elias, she said, and hated how thin it sounded. Man with no last name and no horse and no papers, Caleb said. Walks into my town and tells folks he's found a spring nobody's ever mapped. You understand how that sounds, Clara? To reasonable people. It sounds like a man who found something he thought was worth risking a beating for. Or it sounds like a man running a con. Caleb's voice hardened just slightly, the pleasant surface cracking to show the iron beneath. I've seen it before. Drifter comes through a town in trouble, tells everybody what they're desperate to hear, gets himself fed and housed on the strength of a story. And by the time anybody figures out there's no spring at all, he's 3 counties away with whatever he could carry. He hasn't asked me for a dime. Not yet. Elias came down off of the porch, then slow and deliberate, the hammer set aside, and stood at Clara's shoulder, not crowding her, not stepping in front of her, but present solid, a wall of quiet refusal against Caleb's needling. I not thief, Elias said, and his voice was steady, steadier than Clara had heard it, yet none of yesterday's fractured hesitation in it now. I not can man, I find water, I show. You want proof, I show proof. Caleb studied him for a long moment, iron eyes narrowing slightly, and Clara watched something calculating move behind them, some private recalculation of risk and advantage. All right, Caleb said finally. Show me. The words landed in the street like a stone, dropped in still water, and Clara felt her pulse spike. This was faster than she'd wanted, faster than she'd planned before Sam or the judge had a chance to see the spring themselves, before there was anyone standing beside them whose word carried weight enough to counter whatever story Caleb decided to tell. Not you, she said quickly. Sam Hendricks and Judge Marsh are riding out with him. That's already arranged. Sam Hendricks and Judge Marsh. Caleb repeated something flat and dangerous, entering his tone. You went around asking folks to believe a stranger's story before you brought it to me. Man who owns half the water rights in this valley, and I hear about your secret spring from Walt Dobbins over a whiskey instead of from you directly. I don't answer to you, Caleb. No, Caleb agreed, and the pleasant mask slid fully away, now leaving something harder and colder in its place. But this town does more than you'd like to admit, and it's going to be this town that decides whether to believe a beat-up drifter over the man who's kept water running to every household that's asked for it these past 15 years. He turned his iron gaze back to Elias, and something in it made Clara's skin crawl, some patient predatory calculation. You go find your proof, boy, bring it back, and when you do, we'll see what this town makes of it, and we'll see what this town makes of you. He turned and walked back toward his horse, the small crowd parting around him, the way water parts around a stone, and Clara stood watching him go, with her heart hammering against her ribs and a cold certainty settling into her stomach that whatever came next, it would not come easy. They left before dawn 3 days later, Elias, Sam Hendricks, and Judge Marsh, with 2 mules loaded for a hard 4-day trip into the high country, and Clara stood on her porch in the gray pre-dawn light, watching them go, unable to shake the feeling that she was watching something fragile ride out into a world built to break it. You be careful. She'd told Elias the night before, the 2 of them alone in the kitchen with the lamp burned low, the crude map spread between them one final time. I am careful. Always. He'd folded the map with careful hands, tucked it inside his coat close to his chest. You be careful too. Caleb, he not go away because we leave. He watch you now. Same like he watch me. I can handle Caleb Dawson. I know you can. Something had softened in his gray eyes, then something that made her breath catch unexpected and unbidden. But I still worry. Is allowed to worry for you. She hadn't answered that directly. She hadn't trusted herself to. Now watching the 3 of them disappear north into the mountains, the mule's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that caught gold in the first light, she felt the worry settle into her chest and stay there, a physical weight she carried through the days that followed like a stone in her pocket. The days without him passed strange and slow. Clara kept the boarding house running 3 tenants besides Elias's empty room. An elderly widow named Mrs. Callahan, a traveling salesman who came and went with the seasons, and a young ranch hand named Tommy Briggs, who'd taken a room after a falling out with his father, and threw herself into the small daily rhythms of laundry and cooking and mending, trying not to count the hours until the mountains gave the men back. But Harland Creek did not sit idle in their absence. On the second day, Clara found her front window broken a rock through the glass, no note, no explanation needed. She swept up the shards with her jaw tight and her hands steady and did not cry though she wanted to. On the third day, Mrs. Pruitt refused to sell her flour at the mercantile, claiming a sudden shortage that hadn't existed the week before, and Clara had to drive the wagon to the next town over an hour each way to buy what she needed at a price 20% higher than usual. Caleb's doing, Tommy Briggs told her that evening, 17 years old and earnest in the way only the very young could still afford to be. My pa says Caleb's been talking to folks all week saying you've lost your senses taking in a foreign stranger, saying you're gonna bring ruin down on the whole boarding house on account of some fairy story about water. And what do you think, Tommy? The boy considered the question with more gravity than she expected. I think, he said slowly, that a man who beats another man in the street for talking funny ain't the kind of man I want deciding what's true and what ain't. Clara felt something warm move through the cold, tired weight she'd been carrying all week, and reached over to ruffle the boy's hair the way she hadn't done since he was small enough to tolerate it. You're a good soul, Tommy Briggs. Don't let this town talk you out of it. Yet, on the 4th day, the men came home. Clara heard the mules before she saw them, heard the tired clop of hooves on the dry road, and she was out the front door and halfway down the porch steps before she'd fully registered, moving her heart, hammering with a mixture of relief and dread, so tangled together she couldn't separate one from the other. Elias swung down from his mule, first dust-caked and sunburned and thinner than he'd left, but alive whole. And the moment his eyes found hers across the yard, something in his exhausted face broke open into something like joy. Clara, he said, and crossed the distance between them faster than dignity probably allowed, and for one unguarded moment she thought he might embrace her right there in the street in front of God and everybody, and some reckless part of her wanted him to. He stopped himself just short of it, hands hovering uncertain before settling for gripping both her hands in his, dust and all. We see it, real. All real. Real. Clara repeated, feeling the word land somewhere deep in her chest. Real as rain. Sam Hendricks confirmed, dismounting slower, his old joints stiff from 4 days in the saddle, but his weathered face lit with something Clara hadn't seen on it in months, genuine, unguarded hope. Clara, I have never in my life seen anything like it. Cold water running right out of solid rock, more of it than this whole valley could drink in a year. And never once slowing, not even in this heat. It's true then. Clara's voice came out unsteady. It's really true. I would stake my reputation on it. Judge Marsh said, climbing down with considerably more effort than the younger men, but his old eyes were bright with the same fever of hope that had taken hold of the other two. And Clara, I intend to. First thing tomorrow I mean to put this in writing. Sworn testimony filed with the Territorial Land Office that a viable water source exists on unclaimed federal ground 11 miles north of Harland Creek, sufficient to serve this entire valley if properly channeled. The words hit Clara like a physical thing, hope breaking open in her chest, so suddenly and so completely that her eyes stung with unexpected tears. It's unclaimed federal land, the judge confirmed. Never surveyed for water rights because nobody knew there was water worth surveying. Which means, Clara Bennett, that this spring belongs to no man in this valley, not Caleb Dawson, not anyone until the town petitions the territorial government to claim it as a shared resource. First come, first serve, and we intend to be first. For a moment, standing in her dusty yard with the 4 men who'd risked their reputations and their bodies to bring this news home, Clara allowed herself to believe fully and without reservation that the worst of it was over, that they had found the answer, and now it was only a matter of telling the town, and the town, faced with proof, would surely choose salvation over stubborn suspicion. She was wrong, and the wrongness of it would announce itself before the sun set that same evening. The town meeting was called for 7 o'clock at the church hall. Word spreading fast once Sam Hendricks and Judge Marsh began telling anyone who'd listen what they'd witnessed in the high country. By the time Clara arrived with Elias at her side, no longer hiding him, no longer softening his presence for anyone's comfort, the hall was packed tighter than she'd seen it in years. Every bench filled men standing along the back wall, the air thick with heat and dust, and the particular electric tension of a town that didn't yet know what to believe. Caleb Dawson stood near the front, arms crossed, iron eyes unreadable, and Clara felt the weight of his attention land on her the moment she stepped through the door. Judge Marsh took the front of the room first, laying out what they'd found with the careful, measured precision of a man accustomed to courtrooms. The spring's location, its volume, the geological explanation for why it ran cold and constant, regardless of drought, the legal status of the land itself. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, and the room listened in a silence so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat. "This is our chance," the judge finished, "to save this valley, every ranch, every family, every soul in Harland Creek who's watched their livelihood shrivel these past 2 months. I move that this town petition, the Territorial Land Office, immediately to claim shared rights to this spring, and that we begin without delay the work of channeling that water down to where it's needed." A murmur ran through the room, low and uncertain, hope and disbelief tangled together in equal measure, and for one breathless moment, Clara thought it might actually carry, that the town might simply say yes, might simply choose to believe. Then, Caleb Dawson stood. "I don't doubt Judge Marsh's word," he said, his voice carrying easy and reasonable across the packed hall, the pleasant mask fully back in place. "Man's honest as they come, and I respect him for it. But I'd ask this room to consider something before it goes rushing off to claim water 11 miles into rough country on the strength of a 4-day trip." "Get to your point, Caleb," Sam Hendricks called from the front bench, impatience sharp in his voice. "My point," Caleb said, "is that channeling water 11 miles through mountain terrain isn't a Sunday picnic. That's months of digging, of blasting rock, of laying pipe or cutting trenches, and money this town does not have to spare, money that, if I recall correctly, most every family in this room has already borrowed from me at one point or another." He let that land, let the room absorb the quiet threat folded inside the reasonable words. "So, before we go betting this whole town's future on a spring found by a man nobody here can even properly vouch for, a man with no name, no history, no papers, I think it's fair to ask some hard questions." "His name is Elias," Clara said, standing before she'd fully decided, to her voice cutting clear across the hall. "And every man who rode out with him these past 4 days can vouch for exactly what he found. Sam Hendricks, Judge Marsh. Are their words not good enough for this town anymore, Caleb? Or is it only your word that counts?" A ripple of surprised muttering moved through the crowd. Nobody in Harland Creek was accustomed to hearing Clara Bennett raise her voice in a public hall, least of all against Caleb Dawson. And she felt Elias's hand find hers in the crowded pew, steadying silent support offered without a word. "I never said their word wasn't good," Caleb said, smooth as ever, though something tightened at the corner of his mouth. "I'm only saying this town ought to think carefully before committing everything it's got to a project this size, based on the account of one stranger who showed up out of nowhere the very week this valley's suffering got desperate enough to make folks believe in miracles." "It's not a miracle," Elias said, and the hall went quiet. Every head turning toward the man standing at Clara's side, the man half of them had watched get beaten in the street not a week before. "Is rock, is water, is real, same like this floor, same like this air." He drew a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his broken English carried a weight and steadiness that silenced the last of the muttering. "I lose everything once. Fire, drought. I watch my home die, and I too weak to stop. I not want watch it happen again. I not want stand and do nothing while children here go thirsty, while cattle die in field, while whole town pack up and leave land, their family build with hands and years. I find water. I bring it here. I not ask nothing for myself. I ask only believe. Come see with own eyes if you not trust words. The hall sat in a silence that stretched long and taut, and Clara watched faces around the room, some hardening further arms, crossing old suspicion holding firm. Others, softening something in the plain, unpolished honesty of his words, reaching past the accent, past the stranger's face, into something more universal, that every soul in that room understood the fear of losing everything, and the desperate hope of being saved from it. It was Mrs. Callahan of all people, the elderly widow who boarded in Clara's house, who'd said perhaps a dozen words to Elias, in the week he'd lived under Clara's roof, who broke the silence. "I lost my husband to this drought," she said, her voice thin, but carrying in the quiet hall. Not directly. His heart, the doctor said. But I watched him work himself sick trying to save our well, trying to save what we'd built. And I believe a man doesn't walk 2 days through mountain country and take a beating in the street for a lie. I believe him. So do I, Sam Hendricks said, standing. As do I, Judge Marsh added. And I'll put my name to it in writing before this room if that carries any weight. Slowly, unevenly, other voices began to rise, not a majority, not yet, but enough that Clara felt the balance in the room. Tip felt something shift beneath Caleb Dawson's carefully constructed doubt. Caleb's jaw tightened, iron eyes sweeping the hall, recalculating. Fine, he said finally, his voice hard now, the pleasant mask fully gone. Let the town vote then. But I want it noted, if this valley spends its last dollars and its last strength chasing water 11 miles through rough country, and it comes to nothing, or comes too late, there won't be a second chance. There won't be time to try anything else before this whole basin dries up entirely. His gaze cut to Elias, cold and pointed. And I want it noted that we are betting everything this town has left on the word of a man not one soul in this room actually knows. He turned and walked out of the hall before the vote could even be called, the door swinging shut hard behind him. And Clara felt the cold certainty settle deep in her chest that this was not surrender. This was only the beginning of the fight. The vote passed that night, narrow but real, a petition to the Territorial Land Office, a commitment of labor, and what little money the town could scrape together, a plan to begin surveying the route for a channel within the week. Clara walked home afterward with Elias beside her, under a sky finally blessedly showing the first thin clouds in 2 months, though no rain yet fell. We did it, she said, still half in disbelief. We start, Elias corrected gently. Long way still. Hard way. He glanced sideways at her, something careful and searching in his gray eyes. Caleb not finish. You see his face. I saw it. Clara's stomach tightened at the memory of that cold, calculating look. He's not the kind of man who loses gracefully. No, Elias agreed. He lose nothing yet, only lose control little bit. Man like that, control is everything. He fight harder now, not softer. They walked in silence for a moment, the dark street empty around them, the church hall's lamplight fading behind them into the general dark of the sleeping town. Elias! Clara stopped walking, and he stopped beside her, turning to face her fully in the thin starlight. That thing you said in there about losing everything watching your home burn. You never told me the whole of it. Something shuddered briefly behind his eyes, an old door closing on an old room before he forced it open again, some private decision made. Not tonight, he said quietly. Story too big for tonight, too heavy. But I tell you, someday soon. I promise. Okay, Clara said, and did not push through. Something in her chest ached with wanting to know, wanting to carry some piece of that old grief for him, the way he seemed determined to carry every burden alone. They'd nearly reached the boarding house when Tommy Briggs came running up the road toward them, breathless, his young face pale even in the dark. Miss Bennett, Elias, you need to come quick. The boy's voice shook. Someone set fire to the survey stakes out by the north pasture. The ones marking the channel route. Whole line of them burning right now. Clara's blood went cold. Who? She demanded, though some sick certainty already sat heavy in her stomach. Nobody saw, Tommy said. But everybody's saying... He hesitated, glancing between them. Everybody's saying it's Caleb's men. Nobody can prove it. But everybody's saying it. Elias's jaw set hard and grim, his hand finding Clara's without hesitation, now steady, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. Then we go look, he said. Now, before more burn. They ran. The flames were already climbing high by the time they reached the north pasture, a line of survey stakes, burning like a row of torches, planted deliberately to mock everything the town had voted for not 2 hours before. Clara's lungs burned from the run, her skirts tangled around her legs, and beside her, Elias moved fast and low, already stripping his coat as he ran, beating at the nearest stake before it could catch the dry grass around it and turn a message into a wildfire. Water, he shouted. We need water now before it spread to the field. There isn't any. Clara gasped and heard how obscene the words sounded even as she said them, a valley burning for lack of the very thing they'd just spent an evening arguing over, the very thing sitting cold and abundant 11 miles north, while a fire consumed the proof of their plan to reach it. Sam Hendricks arrived moments later on horseback. Judge Marsh close behind him in a wagon he must have driven at a speed unbecoming a man of 71, and together the 5 of them worked with shovels and dirt and stamped boots to smother what flame they could, choking on smoke eyes streaming until the last stake had burned down to a blackened stub and the immediate danger had passed. 8 stakes, Sam said, breathing hard, surveying the damage in the moonlight. Whole north line gone. That's 2 days of surveying work undone in a single night. 2 days we don't have to spare, Judge Marsh added grimly, leaning on his shovel. Clara turned in a slow circle, scanning the dark tree line at the pasture's edge, half expecting to see Walt Dobbins's shape retreating into the shadows, half expecting nothing at all. And finding nothing at all was somehow worse, because it meant whoever had done this had known exactly how long they had, exactly when to disappear. Caleb wasn't here, she said slowly. He walked out of that meeting 2 hours ago. Man's not fool enough to light the fire himself. Didn't need to, Elias said. His voice low, and hard dust and soot streaked across his face where he'd beaten at the flames barehanded. He only needs say word. Others do rest. You can't prove that, Sam warned. Not a shred of it. And accusing Caleb Dawson outright without proof, that's the fastest way to lose whatever ground we gained tonight. I know, Clara said, though every instinct in her screamed otherwise. But we don't need to prove who lit the fire. We just need to survey it again, tomorrow, before he tries something worse. With what? Sam gestured at the blackened stakes. Half the town's already spent what little goodwill and daylight they had on this. You go back to them tomorrow saying we need to redo 2 days of work because somebody burned it down in the night. Folks are going to start wondering if this whole venture is cursed before it's even begun. Elias crouched beside the nearest ruined stake, running his fingers through the still warm ash, his jaw tight with something that looked less like defeat and more like calculation. Then we not tell them it burn, he said slowly. We tell them we finish early. We work through night. By morning line is done again better than before. Nobody see setback, only see progress. Clara stared at him. You want to resurvey 8 stakes across rough pasture in the dark tonight. I want, Elias said, standing to show this town that fire cannot stop us. That whoever did this, his gray eyes cut toward the dark tree line, toward the direction of the Dawson Ranch, though he named no name. They learn tonight that we do not break so easy. Judge Marsh let out a short, tired laugh, though there was real admiration buried in it. Man's not wrong. There's a message in doing it anyway, doing it fast, doing it without complaint. Fear feeds on hesitation. Don't give it any to feed on. They worked until the sky began to lighten gray at the eastern edge of the valley. 4 exhausted, soot-streaked people driving stakes by lantern light, measuring by memory and moonlight. What Judge Marsh's careful notes from the original survey could confirm. and when the sun finally cracked over the ridge, the line stood restored. Imperfect, hastily done, but standing a small stubborn act of defiance against whatever hand had tried to erase it. Clara barely made it back to the boarding house before her legs gave out beneath her on the porch steps, and Elias caught her elbow before she could stumble, steadying her with an arm that had spent the whole night swinging a shovel and hadn't once complained of the effort. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you. I sleep when this is finished." He helped her through the door, and for a moment in the gray early light of the front hall, exhaustion stripped away whatever careful distance had held between them since that first day in the street. His hand lingered at her elbow, a beat longer than necessary, and she didn't pull away. "Elias!" Her voice came out rough with fatigue, and something else. Something she didn't have the strength left to guard against. "Why do you fight so hard for a town that put its boot in your face the first hour you arrived?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face in the pale light. "Because you did not," he said finally. "One person believe is enough to make whole town worth saving. I learned this long time ago, too late to save my own home. I not make same mistake twice." Clara didn't trust her voice enough to answer that, and so she simply nodded and let him guide her up the stairs, and did not examine too closely the way her chest ached at the plain devotion in his broken English, at the terrible, wonderful weight of being the one person whose belief had been enough. She woke past noon to the sound of raised voices in the street below, and came downstairs still half-dressed to find a crowd gathered outside the boarding house again. Though this time she registered with a jolt, the mood was different, not hostile, curious, almost hopeful. They redid the whole line overnight. Tommy Briggs was telling anyone who'd listen, his young voice bright with something like awe. "Judge Marsh told my pa this morning, said the surveys finished ahead of schedule, all 8 stakes, standing fresh as morning dew. Man's near 72 years old, and he was out there with a shovel till sunup." Clara felt a small, fierce satisfaction settle into her chest, watching the story spread exactly the way Elias had predicted, not as a tale of sabotage and fear, but as a tale of a town too determined to be stopped, and she understood with sudden clarity why he'd insisted on rebuilding through the night instead of confronting the fire in daylight. He'd understood better than any of them that stories mattered as much as facts in a town this small, and that the story you let take root first was the one that grew. But the goodwill didn't last the day. By afternoon, word had spread of a different kind, quieter, uglier, moving mouth to mouth, the way only the worst rumors moved. Caleb Dawson had called in 3 loans that morning all at once, all from families who'd spoken up in favor of the water petition the night before. The Hendersons, the Millers. Old widow Thatcher, whose late husband had borrowed against his land years ago and never fully cleared the debt. Clara heard it from Mrs. Callahan first, delivered over a strained lunch of thin soup and stale bread, the widow's face pale with worry. "Called the note due in full," Mrs. Callahan said. 30 days, or he takes the land. The Hendersons don't have a fraction of what they owe, not with the herd half gone already. Neither do the Millers." Clara set down her spoon, appetite gone entirely. "He's punishing them for voting yes. Nobody's saying that out loud," Mrs. Callahan said carefully. "But everybody's thinking it. It won't work in court." Judge Marsh said that evening when Clara rode out to his study to lay the news before him, Elias silent and grim at her side. "Not if he's calling loans specifically and exclusively against families who supported the petition. That's not sound business practice, that's retaliation, and a territorial judge would see it plain as day." "Then take it to a territorial judge," Clara said. "Takes time, we don't have Clara. Circuit court's not due through this district for another 6 weeks. By then, Caleb will have foreclosed on half this valley and called it business as usual, and there won't be a family left standing to petition for anything." The judge rubbed his eyes, old and weary in the lamplight. "He's found the fastest way to break this town's spirit without ever laying a hand on anyone. Money, debt, the threat of losing the roof over your family's head. That frightens people faster than fire ever could." Elias had been quiet through most of this exchange, his jaw tight, his gray eyes fixed on some middle distance, and now he spoke, his voice low and certain. "Then we finish channel faster than 30 days. Clara turned to him, startled. "Elias, that's 11 miles of terrain. Through rock, through hard ground." "I know distance," he said. "I walk it myself, remember. I know what it take." He looked between her and the judge, something fierce and unyielding settling into his expression. "But if water reach valley before 30 days before Caleb takes single acre, every family who owe him money can sell water instead. Trade it. Use new well to prove land worth more alive than dead, worth more kept than lost. Bank will not want empty land nobody can farm. Caleb will not want land. He cannot make profit from either water or no water. If we move fast enough, we take away reason for him to foreclose at all." The judge stared at him for a long moment, something like genuine surprise crossing his weathered face. "That's not the reasoning of a simple drifter, son. That's the reasoning of a man who understands leverage." "I understand hunger," Elias said simply. "And I understand men who use hunger against people weaker than them. I see it before. I know how it end if nobody stop it in time." The work began the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Every able body in Harland Creek, who could spare a day's labor, gathered at the north pasture, with shovels, picks, wagons, whatever tools the town could scrape together, and Elias at the center of it, directing the dig with an authority that surprised even Clara, who'd only ever seen him quiet and careful, never commanding. "Here," he said, marking a line in the dirt with a stick. Sam Hendricks and a half-dozen other ranchers gathered around him. "Channel go here through low ground, follow natural slope of land, less digging water, do more work itself if we let gravity help." He drew a second line branching off the first. "Second channel, smaller feed to Henderson land first, then Miller, then Townwell last. Closest ranch that lose most cattle, they get water first. Fair. Everyone see it fair." "How do you know all this?" Sam asked, genuinely curious now, some of his early wariness worn fully away by 4 days on the mountain trail and one long night fighting fire together. "Digging channels, reading slope of land. Where's a drifter learn engineering?" Something flickered across Elias's face, old and pained there and gone before anyone but Clara caught it. "My father," he said quietly. "Before fire. He build channel too in old country. I was boy, I watch, I help. I remember more than I know I remember until I need it." Sam didn't push further. Some instinct telling him the subject was a door better left closed, and the work continued sunup to sundown, every family in town taking shifts, the survey stakes marking a path across the dry valley floor like a promise laid down in dirt. Caleb Dawson watched it happen from a distance, riding the ridge above the worksite most afternoons, never coming down to interfere directly, never needing to. His mere presence on the hillside, enough to remind everyone below exactly whose shadow they were laboring under. On the 4th day of digging, disaster struck in a form nobody had anticipated. Tommy Briggs, working a shift alongside his father, went down hard when a section of trench wall collapsed unexpectedly, dirt and loose rock burying him to the waist before anyone could react. Clara heard the shouting from where she stood 200 yards up the line distributing water to the diggers, and dropped everything to run. By the time she reached the site, Elias was already elbow-deep in the collapsed earth, digging with his bare hands alongside Tommy's father, both men working with the desperate speed of people racing against suffocation. "Tommy!" Clara dropped to her knees at the edge of the collapse. "Tommy, can you hear me?" A muffled groan answered her, and relief crashed through her chest, even as the danger remained plainly terribly real. The boy was conscious but pinned, and every shovelful of dirt they moved risked shifting the unstable wall further and burying him worse. "Slow," Elias said sharply when one of the other men moved to dig faster, more frantic. "Slow careful, or wall come down more, crush him worse. We go slow, we go smart." He directed the rescue with the same calm authority he'd shown laying out the channel route, positioning men to brace the loose earth, calling out instructions in his careful broken English that somehow in the crisis carried more weight than perfect fluency ever could have. It took nearly 20 agonizing minutes, Tommy's father, white-faced and silent beside the boy's half-buried body, before they finally freed him, bruised one leg, possibly fractured, but alive, breathing, conscious enough to grip his father's hand and manage a shaky, terrified laugh of relief. "You did that," Clara said to Elias afterward, both of them sitting exhausted in the dirt beside the trench, watching Tommy's father carry his son toward the wagon that would take him to the doctor in town. "You saved him." "We all save him," Elias said, though something in his voice suggested he didn't fully believe his own deflection. "But yes, I'm glad I was here." If that trench wall can collapse without warning Elias what happens 11 miles up in the mountains when we're trying to channel water through rock and loose shale? He was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice had gone careful in a way that told her he'd been thinking about exactly this danger for longer than he'd admitted. "It happened again," he said. "Maybe worse. Mountain rock, not same like valley dirt, more dangerous, more unstable in places. I know this. I see already when I first find spring, some of path is not safe." He looked at her, something heavy and honest in his gray eyes. "I not tell you before because I not want frighten you away from believing. But now I think you should know true danger. This not easy work. People could die finishing it." Clara felt a chill move through her despite the afternoon heat. "Then why didn't you say so at the town meeting?" "Because town needed hope more than warning that night," Elias said. "But you..." He held her gaze steady. "You, I trust with truth, always, even hard truth." Something in her chest tightened at that, at the plain, unguarded weight of being trusted so completely by a man who trusted almost no one, and she found herself reaching for his hand without entirely deciding to dirt and sweat and all, and he let her take it, his rough fingers curling around hers with a gentleness that felt like its own kind of confession. The trouble Caleb Dawson had promised arrived in full 3 days later, and it did not come quiet. Clara was in the kitchen when Judge Marsh arrived at her door, his old face gray with an urgency she'd never seen on him before, even during the fire. "He's filed an injunction," the judge said without preamble, letting himself into the kitchen and dropping into a chair, like his legs could no longer hold the weight of the news he carried. "Territorial court. Claims the survey crossed onto disputed boundary land. He says belongs to his grazing lease, not federal ground at all." "Does it?" Clara asked, though dread already sat heavy in her stomach at the answer she suspected was coming. "It's murky," Judge Marsh admitted. "Old lease boundaries from before the war never properly resurveyed enough ambiguity in the original filing that a judge unfriendly to our cause could rule either way. And Caleb's hired a lawyer out of the territorial capital, a sharp one, who's already filed to halt all channel work pending review." He rubbed his weathered face with both hands. "Clara, if this holds, we could lose weeks, months maybe, tied up in territorial court, while lawyers argue over lines on an old map nobody's looked at in 20 years. "And the loans," Clara said grimly. "The 30 days. The 30 days don't stop for a court injunction. If anything, this buys Caleb exactly what he needs: a legal excuse to halt the work, run out the clock, and foreclose on every family who crossed him, all while looking perfectly within his rights to do it." Elias, who'd been standing quiet by the window through this exchange, turned now with something hard and decided, settling into his expression. "Then we do not stop." "Elias, it's an injunction," Judge Marsh said. "A legal order. If we keep digging in defiance of a court injunction, we hand Caleb exactly the ammunition he needs. Proof this whole venture is lawless, reckless, run by people who don't respect the courts. That could sink us worse than any delay." "Not dig on disputed land," Elias clarified. "Dig everywhere else. Every foot of channel not touching boundary, he claim we finish that first. We show good faith, follow injunction on disputed piece, but we not let whole project stop for one small argument over old map." He looked between them, something sharp and strategic in his gray eyes that Clara had come to recognize as the mark of a man who'd learned somewhere in his hard past to fight battles on more fronts than one. "And Judge, you say lease boundary is murky, never resurveyed properly. Then we resurvey it. Now, Fast. Bring in second surveyor from outside this valley, someone Caleb cannot buy or threaten. Independent proof, clean and clear, who own what land." Judge Marsh stared at him for a long moment, something like reluctant respect breaking through his exhaustion. "There's a certified surveyor in Prescott Junction. 2 days' ride. If we send for him now—" "Send today," Elias said. "Every day we wait is day Caleb use against us." The surveyor from Prescott Junction arrived 6 days later, an unassuming, precise little man named Otis Reinhardt, who spent 2 full days walking the disputed boundary with a transit and a notebook, and returned a finding that landed like a thunderclap through Harland Creek. The disputed section belonged by every legal measure his instruments could determine to federal land, not to Caleb Dawson's grazing lease at all. The old boundary Caleb's lawyer had cited had in fact shifted nearly a quarter mile over decades of imprecise ranch record-keeping, and Caleb's claim collapsed the moment an impartial expert put a straightedge to the actual ground. Clara watched the news spread through town like the first crack of thunder before a long-awaited storm watched faces that had wavered uncertain for weeks finally settle into something like conviction, and felt for one bright, unguarded moment that they had won, that the worst of it was behind them. She should have known better. She should have remembered from every hard lesson Caleb Dawson had taught this valley over 15 patient years that a cornered man does not simply accept defeat. He escalates. The escalation came 2 nights later, and it did not come for the channel or the survey stakes or the legal filings. It came for Elias himself. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass and a man's shout of pain, and she was down the stairs and into the front hall before her mind had fully caught up with her body to find Elias braced against the doorframe. Blood running freely down the side of his head, a rock the size of a fist lying on the floor where it had come through the front window. Elias. She reached him just as his legs began to buckle, catching what weight she could, guiding him down onto the settee with hands that shook worse than she wanted him to see. "What happened? Who did this?" "Outside." He managed, wincing as she pressed a cloth to the gash above his ear. "I hear noise. I go look. Someone throw rock, then run. I not see face. Too dark." "This isn't random," Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, blood soaking through the cloth faster than she liked. "This is Caleb. He's out of legal options, so now he's back to fists and rocks. You not know that. I know exactly that." She pressed harder against the wound, and Elias grimaced, but didn't pull away. "Judge Marsh needs to hear about this tonight. This isn't property damage anymore, Elias. This is assault. This is a man trying to hurt you badly enough to scare you off entirely, or worse." "I not scare so easy," Elias said, though the words came out weaker than he probably intended, blood loss and shock beginning to show plain in his pale face. "You could have been killed." Clara heard her own voice crack on the word, felt something rise in her chest that she didn't have room to examine fully in the crisis of the moment. Raw, naked fear, sharper and more consuming than she'd expected. And beneath it, something else entirely. Something that had been building quietly for 2 weeks now, and finally broke fully open in the terror of nearly losing him. "Do you understand that an inch lower, a harder throw, and that rock could have killed you right there on my porch?" Elias reached up with his uninjured hand and caught her wrist, stilling her frantic pressing at the wound. His gray eyes finding hers steady, despite the pain plainly written across his face. "Clara." "What?" "I not afraid to die for this," he said quietly. "I already lose everything once. Losing it again is not so frightening as you think for man who already survive worst thing. What frightened me—" He hesitated, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "What frightened me is losing you, before I have chance to say what I should say." Clara went very still, her hand pressed against his bleeding temple, the cloth forgotten between her fingers. "Elias, I know is wrong time." He said the words coming faster now, urgent, as if the blow to his head had knocked loose something he'd been carefully containing for 2 weeks. "I know I am stranger still in this town, still fighting to be believed. I know I have nothing to offer, no land, no name, People trust, no certainty. What happened tomorrow? If Caleb win, if I have to leave this valley entire. But I love you, Clara Bennett. I love you, since first day you step into street with only broom in your hand and tell whole town to leave me be. I love you every day, since watching you fight for people who never once fight for you. I not expect you say it back. I only need you know before something worse happen, before I lose chance to say true thing out loud. The front hall had gone utterly silent around them. The only sound the distant tick of the mantel clock and the ragged rhythm of Clara's own breathing, and she looked down at this man bleeding on her settee, broken English carrying more raw honesty than any smooth-tongued suitor had ever offered her. A man who'd walked into her town with nothing and given everything he had to save people who'd greeted him with fists and felt whatever careful walls she'd built around her own heart these past 2 weeks come down all at once without her permission, without her full readiness, but entirely, completely, undeniably. I love you too, she said, and heard her own voice shake with the admission. God help me, Elias. I think I have since that first night watching you draw that map like your whole heart was bleeding onto the paper, along with the ink. Something broke open across his bloodied face. Then not quite a smile. Something rawer, and more overwhelmed than that, the expression of a man who has spent years bracing against a world that only ever took from him, finally impossibly being given something back. She kissed him before either of them could think better of it. Careful of his wound, careful and fierce all at once, and for one suspended moment, the fear and the fire and Caleb Dawson's cold, calculating cruelty fell away entirely, leaving only the two of them finally honest, finally unguarded, in the quiet wreckage of a broken window, and a night that had tried and failed to break something far more essential. But the moment couldn't last, not with blood still seeping from his temple, not with a rock lying on her floor as proof of exactly how far Caleb Dawson was willing to go. And Clara pulled back first, her hands returning to the makeshift bandage with renewed urgency. We need the doctor, she said. And then we need Judge Marsh. Tonight. This has gone past property lines and injunctions, Elias. This is attempted murder, and I intend to see Caleb Dawson answer for it if it's the last thing I do. Clara. Elias caught her hand again, steadying her. Careful. If we accuse him without proof again, we hand him exactly the weapon he wants. Chance to call us reckless, desperate, throwing wild charges because we losing the real fight. Then we find proof. We find proof, he agreed. But tonight we survive. Tomorrow we fight. The doctor came within the hour, stitched the gash above Elias's ear with brisk efficiency, pronounced him fortunate. The rock had struck at an angle, rather than square, and left with strict instructions for rest, that Clara privately doubted either of them would fully heed. Judge Marsh arrived not long after, his old face grim in the lamplight as he took in the broken window, the bloodied cloth, the pale but steady man sitting upright against every instinct toward self-preservation. This changes things, the judge said quietly once the doctor had gone. Property damage, legal injunctions, hardball business tactics, a territorial court might shrug at all of that. Call it the rough and tumble of frontier commerce. But a rock thrown at a man's head in the dead of night hard enough to draw blood close enough to have killed him. That's criminal assault, Clara. And if we can tie it back to Caleb's men, that's the kind of charge that could finally bring federal attention down on this whole ugly business, corruption, intimidation, all of it. Up to Buntim Bachai. How do we tie it back to him? Clara asked. Elias didn't see a face. Judge Marsh was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. There's a territorial marshal stationed 2 days' ride from here out of Prescott Junction, same town as our surveyor as it happens. Man named Marshal Coy Radford, reputation for being incorruptible, which is a rare enough trait in this territory to be worth the ride. If we can get him here, get him looking into the fire, the broken loans, and now this assault, all together as a pattern, rather than isolated incidents, that's a case even Caleb Dawson's money can't entirely bury. Send for him, Clara said immediately. I already have a rider ready to go at first light. The judge's old eyes moved to Elias, something searching in his gaze. Son, I have to ask you plainly, Is there anything in your past, anything Caleb might dig up and use against you, that could undermine your credibility if this comes to a federal inquiry? Better I know now than be blindsided in front of a marshal." Elias was quiet for a long moment, his hand still loosely wrapped in Clara's, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made both of them lean in closer. "There is thing I not tell," he said slowly, "about my past, about why I leave old country, why I come here with nothing." He glanced at Clara, something like an apology in his gray eyes. "I promise tell you soon. Now I think soon must be tonight before Marshall come before Caleb find way to use it against me first." Clara's stomach tightened with sudden apprehension watching him brace himself for whatever confession had been sitting coiled inside him since the day he'd walked into town, and she gripped his hand tighter, steadying him the way he had so many times now steadied her. "Tell us," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Elias drew a long breath, old grief and old fear surfacing plain across his bloodied, exhausted face, and began at last to speak the truth he had carried unspoken across an ocean and 2 years and every mile of his journey into Harland Creek. "My father was not farmer," Elias began, his voice low, halting each word dragged up from a place he'd kept sealed shut for 2 years. "He was engineer, build water system for our village in old country across ocean far east of here, land you would not know the name of even if I say it. He study in city, come home, spend whole life making water reach people who never had it before. I was boy. I follow him everywhere. I learn everything he teach, how red slope of land, how know where water hide beneath rock, how build channel that last 100 years instead of 10. Clara sat very still, her hand still wrapped around his, watching 2 years of buried grief finally surface in his weathered face. "There was man in our village," Elias continued. "Landlord, own most of ground same like Caleb own most of this valley. He not like my father's work, because water my father bring it make small farmers strong, make them not need borrow from landlord no more. Same like here, same story, different land, different tongue." He drew a shaking breath. "Landlord try stop my father many way. Legal way first, same like Caleb try injunction, then other way." His jaw tightened, old fury and old grief warring plain across his face. "One night dry season, whole village burning. Fire start at grain store spread fast, wind carry it everywhere. Landlord's men, we find out later they light it. Want punish village for trusting my father instead of him. Want burn away what my father build, teach whole village lesson about who truly hold power." "Elias," Clara whispered, already understanding where this was going, already feeling the old wound reopen in real time in his gray eyes. "My father died trying save water system," Elias said, his voice breaking now raw and unguarded in a way Clara had never heard from him. "Run back into fire to save record, save map, save proof of everything he build, so landlord could not simply erase whole thing and claim it never exist. Roof collapse. I was 17. I watched from outside, too weak, too young, too afraid, and I could not go in after him. I stand there and watch my father burn, and I do nothing." His hand trembled in Clara's grip. "My mother die 2 year before sickness, before fire ever come. So when fire take my father too, I have nothing left. No family, no home, no land, because landlord claim it all. After say we owe him debt, we never truly owe. I work 3 year on ship, cross ocean, come to this country because I hear stories land where man can start again, land where past not follow you forever." His gray eyes lifted to meet Clara's, raw with 2 years of unspoken grief finally spoken. "Then I come here. I find this valley dying same like my village die. I find spring same skill my father teach me, and I think this time I not stand outside and watch. This time I go in the fire if I must." The room sat in heavy silence, Judge Marsh's old face solemn, Clara's eyes stinging with unshed tears, and it was the judge who finally spoke, his voice gentle in a way Clara had rarely heard from him. "Son, that is not a shameful history. That is the history of a man who has already paid more than any soul in this valley should ever have to pay, and yet come out the other side still willing to fight for strangers who did not deserve his mercy. He leaned forward, old eyes sharp now calculating. But I want you to understand something plainly. If Caleb Dawson or his lawyer digs deep enough to find any part of this story, they will not tell it the way you just told it to us. They will twist it. Foreign troublemaker, they'll say. History of conflict with landowners. A man who burns with old grudges against powerful men and brings that grudge to Harland Creek. I know, Elias said quietly. This why I not tell before. I not want give him weapon. Then we control it, Clara said, sitting up straighter, some fierce protective instinct hardening her voice. We tell it first, our way true and plain, before Caleb has the chance to twist it into something ugly. Marshal Radford hears the truth from your own mouth in front of witnesses who trust you before Caleb's lawyer ever gets the chance to poison the well. Judge Marsh nodded slowly. That's sound thinking. Truth told first plainly carries more weight than truth dragged out under suspicion. Marshal Coy Radford arrived 4 days later, a lean, weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation exactly as Judge Marsh had promised for being a man money couldn't buy. He spent 2 full days in Harland Creek interviewing witnesses methodically. Sam Hendricks about the mountain journey, Judge Marsh about the injunction and the survey dispute. Tommy Briggs's father about the burned stakes, and finally at length Elias himself, who told his story plain and unflinching exactly as he'd told it to Clara and the judge, holding nothing back. That's a hard story, son, Marshal Radford said afterward, his sharp eyes softened with something like genuine sympathy. I'm sorry for your losses, but I have to ask plainly. You understand how it might look a man with your history showing up in a town locked in conflict with its most powerful landowner. I understand, Elias said steadily. I understand better than most man in this valley because I already lived this fight once other side of ocean. This why I know how it end if nobody stop it. This why I not afraid to say truth out loud even if truth make me look guilty to man who not know full story. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something settling into decision behind his sharp eyes. I've seen enough patterns in 15 years of this work to know the difference between a con man building a story and a man telling the truth, even when it costs him. I believe you, Mr. Elias. Now let's see what I can prove about the other side of this. What the marshal proved over the following week unraveled Caleb Dawson's carefully constructed empire thread by thread. He found the man who'd thrown the rock through Clara's window, a ranch hand named Curly Watts, who broke within an hour of questioning, and admitted Walt Dobbins had paid him $5 and a bottle of whiskey for the job, with explicit instructions from Caleb himself. To put a scare into the foreigner, nothing that'll kill him, just enough to remind him he ain't wanted. He found evidence buried in the county land office's records that the boundary dispute Caleb's lawyer had filed was not merely mistaken, but knowingly falsified. An old survey map deliberately altered the ink analysis Marshal Radford commissioned from a specialist in the territorial capital, proving the boundary lines had been redrawn sometime in the past 2 years, long after the original filing in a hand that matched samples from Caleb's own ranch ledgers. And he found most damning of all, a pattern of loan calls stretching back 3 years. Not just the recent foreclosures against the Hendersons and the Millers, but a documented history of Caleb Dawson, calling in debts always and specifically against any family who dared to cross him, refuse a land offer, or speak against him publicly. A pattern too consistent, too deliberate to be explained away as ordinary business practice. It's enough. Marshal Radford told the assembled town at a second meeting called this time not by Judge Marsh, but by federal authority in a hall packed even tighter than before. The whole of Harland Creek crowded in to hear a reckoning 2 months in the making. Enough to bring charges, falsified land records, conspiracy to commit arson, assault, and a pattern of predatory lending practices that a territorial court is going to take a very hard look at. Caleb Dawson stood near the front of the hall. his iron composure cracking visibly for the first time since Elias had walked into town, his face gone pale and hard. "This is a witch hunt," he said, though his voice carried none of its usual smooth confidence. "A drifter with a sob story, and a stubborn woman turned this whole town against a man who's kept this valley running for 15 years. A man who set fire to survey stakes to sabotage a water project this valley desperately needs." Marshal Radford cut in his voice flat and final. "A man who paid to have a rock thrown at another man's skull hard enough to draw blood. A man who falsified a boundary survey to file a fraudulent injunction, and who has spent 3 years calling in debts as punishment against anyone who dared disagree with him. That's not running a valley, Mr. Dawson. That's running a racket." The hall erupted not in violence, but in something almost as overwhelming. 2 months of suppressed fear and quiet resentment breaking loose all at once. Voices rising, old grievances finally finding air. Clara watched Caleb's face in the chaos, watched the iron mask finally fully crack, watched something like genuine fear surface beneath it for the first time since she'd known him. "Sam," Caleb said, turning suddenly toward Sam Hendricks, his voice pitched low, almost pleading. "Sam, you've known me 20 years. You know I'm not. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I only meant to protect what I built." "You meant to protect your power, Caleb." Sam set his weathered face hard and unforgiving. "There's a difference, and near got a man killed proving you don't see it." Marshal Radford placed Caleb Dawson under arrest that same evening, the formal charges to be heard before a territorial judge in Prescott Junction within the month, and Walt Dobbins and Curly Watts alongside him, the whole rotten structure of fear and debt that had held Harland Creek in its grip for 15 years, collapsing in the space of a single hall meeting. With Caleb's arrest, something shifted in the valley that Clara could feel in the very air of the town. A loosening, a lightness, as though the whole basin had been holding its breath for 15 years and had finally collectively exhaled. The channel work resumed the very next morning faster now, unencumbered by legal threats or sabotage. Every family in town turning out to dig with a fervor that hadn't existed even in the project's hopeful beginning. Elias worked harder than anyone directing the final stretch of channel through the roughest terrain with the same careful expertise he'd shown from the start, and Clara watched him move through the work with something new in his bearing. Not the wary, braced posture of a stranger expecting rejection at every turn, but something that looked unmistakably like belonging. "You're different," she told him one evening, the two of them sitting on her porch steps after a long day's labor, watching the last light fade gold over the valley. "Different how?" "Lighter," Clara said, "like some weight you've been carrying finally set down." Elias considered this, his gray eyes following the direction of the mountains, dark now against the fading sky. "I carry that weight 2 years," he said. "Guilt for father I not save. Anger for man who take everything from me and never pay for it. I think I carry it forever, until I find some way make it right." He turned to look at her, something soft and unguarded in his expression. "Watching Caleb finally answer for what he do is not same as saving my father. Nothing bring him back, but is close enough to justice that I finally feel weight lift little bit. Like maybe I not fail everyone I try protect. Like maybe this time I save something." Clara reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, without hesitation. Now the gesture as natural as breathing after everything they'd survived together. "You saved this whole valley, Elias. Every family who was one dry well away from losing everything, you saved them." "We saved them," he corrected gently. "You first. You saved me in street when nobody else would look at me. Everything after is only me trying to be worthy of that first kindness." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky deepened toward full dark, and Clara found herself thinking with a clarity that surprised her that she could not imagine the coming years of her life without this man beside her, this careful, broken English, iron-willed stranger who had walked into her town with nothing and given everything he had over and over without ever once asking for anything in return, except the simple mercy of being believed. The channel reached the valley floor 11 days later, on a morning bright and cloudless, The whole town gathered at the terminus, where Judge Marsh had insisted on building a proper stone catch basin, the first visible destination for water that had traveled 11 miles from a spring no one in Harland Creek had known existed a month before. Clara stood beside Elias at the front of the crowd, Sam Hendricks and his surviving cattle penned nearby in eager anticipation. Tommy Briggs propped up on crutches with his splinted leg. Mrs. Callahan dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief before a single drop had even arrived, and the whole town held its breath together as the first trickle of water, cold, clear, impossibly persistent, came around the final bend of the channel and began to fill the stone basin. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The whole valley stood transfixed by the simple, miraculous sight of water where 2 months of drought had promised only dust and ruin. Then Tommy Briggs let out a whoop that broke the spell entirely, and the crowd surged forward all at once, cheering, embracing grown men weeping openly, without a shred of the shame such a display would have carried a month before, and Clara found herself laughing and crying at once, gripping Elias's arm as the basin filled and began finally to overflow into the smaller channels that would carry salvation to every dying field and thirsty herd in the valley. "We did it," she said, turning to him, her face wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. "Elias, look what you did." "What we did," he said again. But this time, he didn't fully finish the correction because Clara had already pulled him into an embrace, fierce enough to steal the words from his mouth entirely. And the whole watching town for once offered nothing but warmth and welcome. In return, the same crowd that had watched him beaten in the street 2 months before now, cheering his name. Some of them, the same men who'd once looked away in silence, now clasping his hand, thanking him with a sincerity that could not be faked or bought. Even Mrs. Pruitt, of all people, approached later that afternoon, her sharp face uncharacteristically soft. "I owe you an apology, young man," she said stiffly, extending a hand she clearly found difficult to offer. "I said unkind things back when you first came. I was wrong. This valley owes you a debt I don't know how we'll ever fully repay." "No debt," Elias said, shaking her hand with the same quiet grace he'd shown every hardship this town had thrown at him. "Only remember this next time stranger walk into town. Not every different face is threat. Sometimes is only person needing chance." Mrs. Pruitt's eyes glistened, and she nodded, unable to fully speak past whatever emotion had risen in her throat, and walked away, dabbing at her eyes with the same handkerchief she'd once used to fan away her disapproval of Clara Bennett's foolish charity. Caleb Dawson's trial, when it finally came before the territorial judge in Prescott Junction 3 weeks later, proved swift and merciless in its conclusions. The falsified survey, the arson, the assault, the years-long pattern of predatory debt collection, the evidence Marshal Radford had assembled left little room for defense, and Caleb was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, his ranch and water rights seized and sold at auction to satisfy the debts and damages owed to the families he'd wronged. Walt Dobbins received a lighter sentence for his role as accomplice, and Curly Watts, having cooperated fully with the marshal's investigation, avoided prison entirely in exchange for testimony, though he left Harland Creek within the week, unable to face the community he'd betrayed for $5 and a bottle of whiskey. Clara attended the trial alongside Judge Marsh, watching Caleb Dawson stand before the bench in shackles. The iron composure that had ruled Harland Creek for 15 years finally completely broken, and felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more complicated. A sorrow for the ruin. A man's own pride and greed had brought down upon himself, tangled together with relief that the valley at last was free of his shadow. It didn't have to end this way, she told Elias on the ride home, the territorial capital's dust still on their clothes, the long journey back to Harland Creek stretching golden and quiet before them. No, Elias agreed. He could choose different many times, choose fear over greed, choose neighbor over profit. He'd choose wrong every time, until choosing ran out. He looked at her, something gentle and knowing in his gray eyes. This is difference between man like Caleb and man like Sam Hendricks in end. Both face same fear, losing everything in drought in hard year. One choose hold tighter, take from other to protect self. Other choose open hand trust, neighbor, even when trusting costs something. He reached over and took her hand, resting easy against the worn leather of the wagon seat. You teach me this first day without even meaning to teach. Open hand even when world give you every reason to close it. Clara felt her chest tighten with the plain, unguarded love in his words, and she leaned into his shoulder as the wagon carried them home, watching the mountains rise gray and familiar on the northern horizon. The same mountains he'd walked out of 2 months before, carrying nothing but a stone. A secret and a determination not to fail a second time at the one thing that mattered most. The valley bloomed in the weeks that followed, in a way Harland Creek had not seen in years. Grass greening along the new channels, cattle fattening on grazing land. No longer choked by drought, gardens that had withered to brown stubs, pushing new growth toward a sun that no longer felt like punishment now that water ran freely beneath it. Sam Hendricks's herd began to recover its numbers. The Hendersons and the Millers, freed from Caleb's foreclosure threat by his conviction and the dissolution of his debts under the settlement Judge Marsh had negotiated on their behalf, kept their land outright, the water rights redistributed fairly among every family in the basin, under a new cooperative charter the town had voted into being at its very next meeting. Clara's boarding house filled to capacity for the first time in years. Travelers and new settlers drawn by word of a valley reborn. And she found herself more days than not too busy with the practical business of running a thriving house to dwell long on the quiet, persistent ache of watching Elias grow more settled, more at home, more woven into the fabric of a town that had once tried to beat him into leaving. But even as the valley healed, one thing remained unspoken between them, a question neither had yet found the courage to ask plainly, though it hung in the air between every shared glance, every lingering touch, every evening spent together on the porch, watching the mountains darken toward night. It was Judge Marsh, of all people, who finally forced the matter into the open, cornering Elias one afternoon at the general store with the blunt directness of a man in his 8th decade who'd long since stopped bothering with delicate approaches to plain truths. Son, the judge said, you've been sweet on that woman for 2 months now, and she's been sweet on you right back, plain as day to anyone with eyes. What in God's name are you waiting for? Elias looked genuinely startled by the bluntness of the question. He hesitated, old uncertainty surfacing. I have nothing to offer her, Judge. No land. No name this town fully trust even now. I am still in many ways stranger here. You are the man who saved this entire valley from ruin, Judge Marsh said. The man half this town owes their livelihood to the man Clara Bennett has loved plainly and completely since roughly the second day you set foot on her porch. If that's not enough to offer a woman's son, I don't know what more you think you're waiting to earn. Elias was quiet for the long moment, turning the judge's words over with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything, and something in his gray eyes, finally fully settled, 2 years of grief and wandering and hard-won survival, crystallizing at last into simple, unguarded resolve. You are right, he said. I wait too long already for something that should already be mine to claim. That evening, as the sun set, gold and full over a valley finally green with water and hope, Elias found Clara on the porch of the Bennett house, mending a torn shirt in the last of the daylight, and knelt before her without preamble, without the careful, halting hesitation that had marked so much of his speech these past 2 months. Clara Bennett, he said, his voice steady now, certain in a way she'd rarely heard from him. I come to this valley with nothing but stone and secret, and I find in you something I not expect to find again after everything I lose. I find home. I find person who believe me, when whole world tell her not to. I find... His voice caught briefly before he pushed through it. I find woman I want, spend rest of my life beside, if she will have broken English and stubborn heart, and man, who's still learning how to say everything he feel. He withdrew from his coat pocket the same smooth gray stone he'd carried from the spring on that first terrible day, worn now smoother still from months of being carried close, and held it out to her in his open palm. I have no ring, he said. Only this. Same stone I show you first night when I have nothing else to prove I speak truth. I give it to you now as promise instead of proof. Marry me, Clara. Let me spend every day I have left proving I am worthy of chance you give me that first day in the street." Clara looked down at the smooth stone in his palm, the same stone that had carried an impossible hope from a hidden spring to a dying town, the same stone that had sat cool and constant on her kitchen table through every crisis and triumph of the past 2 months, and felt her answer rise in her chest with a certainty that needed no deliberation at all. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and unshaking, carrying 2 months of hard-won love and 2 months of fear finally fully released. "Yes, Elias. 1,000 times yes." News of the engagement spread through Harland Creek before the sun had fully risen the next morning, carried mouth to mouth with the same speed that had once carried whispers of suspicion about the stranger from the north. Except now, every word came wrapped in warmth instead of doubt. Clara woke to find a basket of fresh eggs left on her porch by the Hendersons, a jar of preserves from Mrs. Callahan, and a hand-carved wooden box from Sam Hendricks containing a note that simply read, "For whatever this man decides to put a ring in once he's saved up enough to buy one proper." She laughed until she cried reading it, and when Elias came down from his room to find her still wiping her eyes at the kitchen table, he crossed to her side immediately, alarm plain on his face. "What happened? You cry. Why you cry?" "Good tears," she managed, pulling him down beside her, showing him the note and watching his own face crack into the widest smile she'd seen from him, yet 2 months of careful restraint finally giving way entirely to open joy. "This town," he said, shaking his head slowly, wonder plain in his voice. 2 months ago this same town want me gone before sundown. Now they leave eggs on porch and joke about wedding ring. People change, Elias. You change them." "No." He caught her hand, pressed it against his chest where she could feel his heart beating steady beneath his shirt. "You change them first. I only give them reason to trust what you already believe." They set the wedding for 6 weeks out, time to fall just after the valley's first proper harvest. In 2 years, wheat and corn grown fat and green on fields. The new water channels had brought back from the edge of ruin. Cattle fattened past anything Sam Hendricks had dared hope for, back when he'd stood in his dying pasture and decided to risk everything on a stranger's story. The whole town seemed to throw itself into the preparations with a fervor that went beyond ordinary neighborliness, as though celebrating this one marriage had become somehow a way of celebrating the valley's survival entire. Judge Marsh insisted on performing the ceremony himself, despite Clara's gentle protest that surely a proper minister ought to be sent for from the territorial capital. "I have married 11 couples in this valley over the past 30 years, the old judge said with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided something and did not intend to be argued out of it, and buried considerably more people than that, and I intend to marry the 12th couple myself. Thank you kindly, seeing as I rode 4 days into the mountains with this man before half this town would even shake his hand. I've earned it." Clara didn't argue further. Some battles weren't worth winning. The weeks passed in a blur of preparation and ordinary happiness that felt, after everything the valley had survived, almost unbearably sweet. Elias spending his days finishing the last stretches of the water channel system, ensuring every family's land received fair and equal share, and his evenings on Clara's porch slowly, patiently teaching himself to read properly from her father's old books, determined that no man would ever again have cause to doubt him for want of words. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," Clara told him one evening, watching him puzzle through a page of scripture with fierce concentration, his finger tracing beneath each unfamiliar word. "I not do this to prove," Elias said, not looking up. "I do this because I want, because I have chance now first time in long time to build something instead of only survive. Reading is part of building." He glanced up at her, something soft in his gray eyes. "You give me chance to be more than survivor, Clara. I not waste it." Tommy Briggs. His leg fully healed, now insisted on being the one to ride out and fetch fresh flowers from the high meadows for the wedding, refusing every offer of help with the fierce dignity of a boy who'd nearly died in a collapsed trench and had spent every day since looking for ways to prove his gratitude wasn't merely words. "Man saved my life," he told Clara, loading saddlebags with a determination well beyond his 17 years. "Least I can do is bring him proper flowers for his wedding day. My ma says the high meadows are thick with wild columbine this time of year on account of all the new water reaching places that were dust 2 months back." He returned 2 days later with saddlebags full of blue and white blooms, sunburned and triumphant, and presented them to Clara with a formal little bow that made her laugh and pull him into a hug he endured with the long-suffering patience of a boy who secretly didn't mind at all. The valley itself seemed to conspire toward celebration in those final weeks before the wedding. The first real rain in months arrived gentle and soaking, rather than the violent cloudbursts that sometimes followed long droughts, filling the new channels to their brims, and leaving the whole basin smelling of wet earth and new growth for the first time in what felt like years. Clara stood on her porch the morning after that rain, watching mist rise off fields gone suddenly impossibly green, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she could only describe as peace. "It's like the whole valley's celebrating with us," she said when Elias came to stand beside her, still faintly damp himself from checking the channels at first light. "Maybe it is," he said. "Land remember what happened to it same like people do. This valley almost die. Now it live again. Maybe it knows something good is coming, same like we do." But even amid the joy, one shadow remained: a letter that arrived from the territorial capital 10 days before the wedding, addressed to Elias, directly bearing an official seal that made Clara's stomach clench with instinctive dread the moment Judge Marsh delivered it to their door. "It's from the immigration office," the judge explained, his old face carefully neutral, in a way that told Clara he already suspected trouble before Elias had even broken the seal. "Standard inquiry given everything that's come out during Caleb's trial, a man's foreign origins, no prior naturalization papers, testifying as a key witness in a major territorial case. Someone in the capital took notice, wants to verify his standing before the conviction goes to final appeal." Elias read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening progressively with each line, and when he finally looked up, something like the old wariness Clara hadn't seen in weeks had crept back into his gray eyes. "They want I come to capital," he said quietly. "Prove citizenship. Prove I have right to remain in this country at all." He set the letter down with hands that weren't quite steady. "I never file proper papers when I first arrive. I was," he searched for the word, "old shame surfacing. Illegal, technically. I work 3 year on ship arrive with nothing, no money for proper filing, no time before I already traveling west looking for new start. I think foolish maybe, that if I simply work hard, cause no trouble, nobody ever ask question. But you caused a very large amount of trouble," Judge Marsh said, not unkindly, "in the very best possible way, by exposing one of the most significant corruption cases this territory has seen in a decade. That tends to draw official attention, son, whether you intended it or not." Clara felt fear coil tight in her chest, sharp and immediate. What happens if they find his papers aren't in order? Can they? She couldn't quite make herself finish the question, the possibility too terrible to speak aloud. "Deport him," Judge Marsh said plainly, because the old man had never believed in softening hard truths, not even to spare feelings. "It's possible. Not certain, not with everything he's done for this territory, but possible. Immigration law is inconsistent at best out here, and a great deal depends on which official happens to review his case and how sympathetic or unsympathetic that official happens to feel toward foreign-born witnesses in politically sensitive trials." The words landed in the room like a physical blow, and Clara felt the ground she'd thought entirely solid beneath her feet tilt sickeningly. The wedding, the future, the whole bright unfolding life she'd finally allowed herself to imagine suddenly terribly uncertain. "There has to be something we can do," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained panic. "He's about to marry an American citizen. He's a key witness in a federal corruption case. He saved this entire valley. All of that helps," Judge Marsh said, "and none of it guarantees anything. Not with bureaucracy, this new and this inconsistent. But Clara, listen to me. I intend to ride to that capital myself alongside Elias, and I intend to bring Marshal Radford's full testimony. Sam Hendricks's testimony, my own testimony, and if it comes to it, I will personally vouch for this man's character before whatever official dares question it. I did not spend 30 years practicing law in this territory to watch bureaucratic nonsense undo everything this valley fought to build. They rode out for the territorial capital. 3 days later, Elias, Judge Marsh, and Clara herself, who refused every suggestion that she remain behind and wait for news, unable to bear the thought of sitting idle, while Elias's future hung uncertain in some official's hands 4 days' ride away. The journey passed in a tension Clara hadn't felt since the darkest days of the fight against Caleb Dawson. Elias unusually quiet through most of it. Old fears resurfacing that she recognized now as the deep bone-level dread of a man who had already lost everything once to forces beyond his control, and could not fully believe even now that such loss might not simply come again. "Talk to me," she said, on the second night of their journey, the campfire burning low between them. Judge Marsh already asleep a respectful distance away. "You've barely said 10 words since we left." Elias stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I am afraid." He admitted finally, the confession costing him something visible, some old pride finally cracking under the weight of honest fear. "Not for myself. I already survive worse than deportation. I am afraid for you. If they send me away, Clara, what happened to wedding? What happened to life you finally let yourself imagine after everything?" Clara reached across the fire and took his hand, holding it steady in both of hers. "Then I follow you," she said simply. "Wherever they send you, Elias, I go too. I didn't fight this hard, didn't risk this much to let some official's stamp on a piece of paper decide whether we get to be together." "You have whole life here," he protested. "Boarding house, friends, this valley you helped save." "I have you," Clara said. "And everywhere else is just geography." She squeezed his hand tighter. "I love this valley, Elias, I do. But I love you more, and I have loved you since before I fully understood what loving you would cost. If it costs leaving Harland Creek behind, then that is a price I am willing to pay, and I need you to understand that plainly, because I will not have you carrying this fear alone one moment longer than necessary." Something in his face broke open at that old fear, giving way to something raw and grateful and overwhelmed all at once, and he pulled her into an embrace fierce enough to steal the breath from her lungs, murmuring something in his old tongue that she didn't understand, but felt plainly carried the same weight as everything he'd ever told her in his careful, hard-won English. The territorial capital proved a labyrinth of official offices and indifferent clerks, and it took the better part of 2 full days simply to secure an audience with the immigration official assigned to Elias's case, a precise, unsmiling man named Deputy Commissioner Harland Voss, who reviewed the file before him with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of a man entirely unmoved by the urgency of those waiting on his decision. "Mr. Elias," he said, consulting his papers, "you entered this country without proper documentation, some 2 years prior, worked without filing for legal status, and have remained in the territory undocumented ever since. Is that an accurate summary?" "Yes," Elias said, refusing. Clara noted with fierce pride to hide or soften the truth, even now when doing so might have served him better. "I not have money for proper filing when I arrive. I not understand process. I work honest cause no trouble, but I not file paper. This true. And now you find yourself a central witness in a significant territorial corruption case, engaged to marry an American citizen and applying somewhat belatedly for legal status." Deputy Commissioner Voss's tone carried no particular warmth, but no particular hostility, either simply the flat neutrality of a man accustomed to weighing facts without sentiment. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Elias. Cases like yours are decided as much by circumstance and discretion as by strict letter of law. I could rule against you, cite the technical violation, and have you removed from the territory within the month. Or I could consider the fuller context of your case." "Then consider it," Judge Marsh said, stepping forward, before Voss could continue, his old voice, carrying the full authority of 30 years legal standing in the territory. "Deputy Commissioner, I have here sworn testimony from Marshal Coy Radford regarding this man's role in exposing a conspiracy of arson assault and fraudulent land seizure that would otherwise have gone entirely unpunished. I have testimony from Sam Hendricks and a dozen other landowners in Harland Creek attesting to this man's character and his singular contribution to saving an entire valley from ruin. I have my own testimony as a sitting territorial judge of 30 years standing that I have never in my career encountered a man of more genuine integrity than the one standing before you today. Voss's careful neutrality flickered just slightly, some genuine consideration entering his expression as he accepted the thick folder of documents the judge extended toward him. "This is considerable testimony," he admitted, leafing through the pages with growing interest. "It's the truth," Clara said, unable to hold her silence any longer, stepping forward beside Elias with her chin raised, refusing to let fear soften her voice. "Deputy Commissioner, I understand you have a technical violation to weigh. I understand the law exists for good reason, but I am asking you to weigh it against everything this man has done since arriving in this territory. Every act of courage, every risk he took to save people who initially met him with nothing but suspicion and violence. He is not a burden on this territory. He is one of the finest things to happen to it in a decade." Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents before him, and Clara felt the seconds stretch unbearably, her heart hammering against her ribs, Elias's hand finding hers and gripping tight beside her. "I cannot simply overlook a legal violation," Voss said finally, "even one committed apparently out of ignorance rather than malice. However," he set the documents down, removed his spectacles, and looked directly at Elias for the first time, with something that might cautiously have been called respect. "I am authorized to grant expedited naturalization proceedings in cases where an applicant can demonstrate exceptional service or contribution to the territory, a provision rarely invoked, but entirely applicable here given the testimony before me. It will require additional paperwork, an interview before a territorial magistrate, and a waiting period of no less than 60 days. But Mr. Elias, based on what I have read today, I am prepared to recommend approval of your naturalization application rather than deportation." The words landed in the small office like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and Clara felt the fear of the past week collapse all at once into overwhelming, dizzying relief. Her knees genuinely weak beneath her, for a moment, before Elias's arm came around her, steadying her the way he had so many times now, steadied her through every crisis this long, hard-won journey had thrown at them. "Thank you." Elias managed his voice thick with an emotion he didn't bother to hide this time. "Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. I not have words enough for what this mean." "Don't thank me," Voss said, allowing himself the ghost of a smile as he began drawing up the necessary paperwork. "Thank the judge who rode 4 days to vouch for you and the woman who stood in a stranger's corner when the rest of her town wanted him gone. Men like you are rare, Mr. Elias, but so are advocates like them. You'd do well to remember that going forward." Ugh. They rode home to Harland Creek 4 days later, the 60-day waiting period ahead of them now a formality rather than a threat, and the wedding delayed only slightly to accommodate the journey rescheduled for 2 weeks. Hence, the whole ordeal transformed in retrospect into simply one more trial the two of them had faced and overcome together. The valley welcomed them home with the same warmth it had shown throughout the preparations, and if anything, news of their ordeal in the capital only deepened the town's affection for the man who had once walked into their midst as an unwelcome stranger and had, through nothing but persistence and honesty and an unbreakable commitment to doing right by people who owed him nothing, become one of their own in every way that mattered. "You know," Sam Hendricks said, joining Elias at the fence line one evening, as the two of them worked to repair a section of pasture fencing. "There was a time not so long back I'd have bet good money you'd be run clean out of this valley inside a week." "I remember that time," Elias said, a wry smile touching his mouth. "I remember it very clear. Funny how things turn out." Sam set another post, tamping the earth down around it, with the easy rhythm of a man who'd done this work his whole life. "Man comes walking out of the mountains with nothing but a stone and a story nobody wanted to believe. And 2 months later he saved the whole valley, married the finest woman in 3 counties, and near about become the most respected man in Harland Creek. He glanced sideways at Elias, something warm and genuine in his weathered face. For what it's worth, I'm glad Clara didn't listen to the rest of us that first day. Glad she saw something worth trusting when the rest of this town only saw a stranger to fear. "I glad too," Elias said quietly. "More than I have words to say." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day the valley hadn't seen in years before the drought, before the fire, before everything that had brought Elias walking down out of the mountains with nothing but hope and a memory of cold water running through limestone. Clara stood in her room at the boarding house, dressed in a gown Mrs. Callahan and the other women of the town had helped sew over the preceding weeks. Simple, elegant, embroidered along the hem with small blue flowers, meant to echo the wild columbine Tommy Briggs had ridden 2 days to bring back from the high meadows, and looked at her reflection with a wonder she hadn't expected to feel even after everything. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Callahan said, adjusting a stray curl with gentle hands, her own eyes already misty. "Your mother would be so proud, Clara. So proud of everything you've built, everything you've become. I couldn't have done any of it alone," Clara said, meaning the words, fully thinking of every hand that had reached out to help across these past 2 months. Sam Hendricks riding into the mountains on nothing but faith. Judge Marsh staking his reputation on a stranger's map. Tommy Briggs running through the dark to warn them of fire. Mrs. Callahan herself and Mrs. Pruitt's grudging apology. And every soul in Harland Creek who had eventually chosen belief over fear. "None of us do," Mrs. Callahan said gently. "That's rather the whole point, isn't it? We save each other, or we don't get saved at all." The church stood full to capacity when Clara walked down the aisle on Judge Marsh's arm, the old man having insisted on the honor since Clara's own father had been gone these 5 years, and she found Elias waiting for her at the front, dressed in a new suit the town's tailor had finished just that week. His gray eyes bright with an emotion so plain and unguarded it took her breath entirely away. He looked, she thought, nothing like the beaten, bleeding stranger who had knelt in the dust of Main Street 2 months before. He looked like a man who belonged to this valley, to this town, to her as fully and completely as any man born and raised on this soil his whole life. The ceremony passed in a blur of joy that Clara would spend years afterward trying and failing to fully capture in memory. Judge Marsh's voice, steady and warm, as he spoke the words that had bound 11 other couples before them. Elias's hand trembling slightly as he slid a proper ring onto her finger. At last purchased with wages he'd insisted on earning honestly over these past weeks, rather than accepting as gift from anyone in town. The whole assembled congregation of Harland Creek rising as one when Judge Marsh finally joyfully pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," the judge said, and Elias did gently, reverently, as though she were something precious beyond measure, and the church erupted into cheering and applause that seemed to Clara, in that suspended perfect moment, to carry the whole weight of everything this valley had survived together: drought and fire, corruption and cruelty, fear and doubt, finally fully transformed into something worth celebrating without reservation. The reception spilled out across the churchyard and down toward the new water channel that ran cool and constant along the edge of town. Every family in Harland Creek contributing something to the feast tables groaning under dishes made possible only by a harvest that would have been impossible 2 months before. And as the afternoon stretched toward golden evening, Clara found herself standing beside the channel with Elias, watching water that had traveled 11 miles from a spring he'd found by following deer through unfamiliar mountains, water that had saved a valley, and in the saving of it, remade both their lives entirely. "Do you remember," she said, "that first night when you drew the map on the flour sack, and I asked you why you kept fighting for a town that had already tried to run you off?" "I remember," Elias said. "I tell you, one person believe is enough to make whole town worth saving." "I've thought about that a great deal these past 2 months," Clara said. "I think it works both ways, you know. One person willing to be believed in, willing to keep trying even after being beaten down, willing to trust a town that gave him every reason not to, that's enough to save a place too. maybe more than the water ever was. Elias considered this, watching the channel's steady current catch the last gold light of the setting sun, and something settled fully into his weathered, contented face. The look of a man who had finally completely set down a burden he'd carried alone for 2 long years across an ocean and half a continent. "I think," he said slowly, "water saved the land. But you in this town choosing believe when belief cost something that saved me." He turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his, the new ring catching the light between them. "I come to this valley broken, Clara. Empty. Man with nothing left but memory of fire and failure. I not expect to find home again. I not expect to find love again after everything I lose." His voice caught, thick with an emotion 2 months of hardship had only deepened rather than diminished. "But I find both here in this valley that almost die, same like everything else I ever love. And this time, I not too late. This time, I not too weak. This time, I save what matter most, and it saved me back." Clara felt tears rise warm and unashamed, and did not try to stop them, standing there in the golden evening light beside the water that had changed everything, surrounded by a town that had learned slowly and imperfectly and completely what it meant to choose kindness over fear, belief over suspicion, and open hands over closed fists. Behind them the valley stretched green and thriving toward the darkening mountains, cattle grazing fat on grass that drought had nearly claimed forever. Fields heavy with a harvest that had seemed impossible just months before, a whole community bound together. Now not by fear of one powerful man's shadow, but by the simple hard-won knowledge that strangers were not always threats. That different was not always dangerous, and that sometimes the person who seemed to have the least to offer carried in truth everything a dying place needed most. Tommy Briggs found them there, as the stars began to emerge overhead, breathless and grinning, tugging at Elias's sleeve with the boundless energy of a boy who had nearly died once and had spent every day since, determined to live twice as fully for it. "Come on," he said. "Everybody's waiting for the first dance. Whole town's waiting." Elias looked at Clara, and something passed between them that needed no translation. No careful searching for the right English words, a wordless understanding built across 2 months of fire and fear, and finally, triumphantly, love. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his hand. "Always," Clara said, and took it. They walked together back toward the lights and music of the celebration, back toward a town that had once tried to beat him into leaving, and now could not imagine Harland Creek without him, back toward the water that ran cold and constant and endless through a valley that would never again know the particular terror of a drought with no answer. And as they danced beneath the summer stars, surrounded by every soul who had learned through hardship and fear, and finally through grace, that the greatest treasures often arrive wearing the face of a stranger, Clara Bennett understood with complete and unshakable certainty that she had found in the man who once knelt bleeding in her town's dust not merely a husband, but the truest kind of home a person could ever hope to build. The valley lived, the town had healed, and love, once given a chance against every fear that stood in its way, had proven itself the one force strong enough to outlast even the longest, cruelest drought.